Chapter 1: Introduction to Market Structure and Competition. Welcome, dear students, to the gentle unfolding of economic thought. Last time, we considered the elegant dance of supply and demand. Now let us turn our attention to a more strategic consideration: the fascinating world of market structure and the subtle art of maintaining a dominant position within it. Specifically, we will explore the concepts of entry deterrence and the construction of strategic barriers, focusing on two key mechanisms: limit pricing and capacity expansion. Think of this as the cultivation of a garden, where the existing flora takes measures to ensure its continued flourishing and limit the growth of potentially competing sprouts. Market structure overview. Before diving into the tactics, let us briefly survey the landscape of market structure. Imagine a spectrum, ranging from the perfectly competitive market, a vibrant, teeming ecosystem with countless participants, none wielding significant influence, to the pure monopoly, a solitary giant holding sway over the entire domain. In between lie various shades of imperfect competition, such as oligopoly and monopolistic competition, where a few powerful players, or many differentiated ones, engage in a complex interplay of strategy and counter-strategy. Our focus tonight largely resides in these imperfectly competitive realms, for it is here that the incentives and possibilities for entry deterrence are most pronounced. The threat of entry and deterrence. Now, consider the incumbent firm already established within a market. Its cozy existence, perhaps generating significant profits, is perpetually threatened by the possibility of new entrants, eager competitors seeking to carve out their own piece of the pie. The higher the perceived potential profitability of the market, the more alluring it becomes to these prospective entrants. Entry deterrence, then, becomes a crucial objective for the incumbent, a strategic imperative to maintain its market share and profitability. This involves signaling to potential rivals that entering the market will be difficult, unprofitable, or even disastrous. This can be achieved through various means, which we broadly categorize as strategic barriers to entry. Limit pricing. A gentle warning. One of the classic strategies is known as limit pricing. The incumbent firm deliberately sets its price lower than the profit-maximizing level it could charge if there were no threat of entry. This reduced price serves as a signal to potential entrants. It communicates that the market is not as lucrative as they might initially believe. Think of it as a gentle warning whispered on the wind. The margins here are thin. Proceed with caution. The success of limit pricing hinges on the credibility of this signal. Potential entrants must believe that the incumbent will maintain this lower price even after entry occurs. This belief is often underpinned by the incumbent's ability to maintain low costs, or its willingness to engage in aggressive price competition if challenged. The classical economist might argue that such a tactic is not rational if it harms current profits, but the strategic benefit lies in deterring future competition and maintaining long-term dominance. Capacity expansion. Building walls. A more concrete, and often more effective, barrier to entry involves capacity expansion. The incumbent invests in significant productive capacity, exceeding current demand. This overcapacity serves as a credible threat. It signals that the incumbent is prepared to aggressively increase output, drive down prices, and engage in a price war if a new entrant dares to challenge its position. Imagine building a massive fortress, its walls imposing and well defended. The policymaker may see this as potentially inefficient, as resources are tied up in unused capacity. However, from the incumbent's perspective, the cost of this excess capacity is a worthwhile investment if it effectively deters entry and protects its market share. The interplay and limitations. It is important to remember that these strategies are not employed in isolation. Often, they are combined and interwoven to create a more formidable and multifaceted barrier to entry. However, these strategies are not without their limitations. Limit pricing can reduce current profits, and capacity expansion ties up capital. Moreover, the credibility of these strategies depends on the specific characteristics of the market, the costs of entry, and the expectations of potential entrants. Incorrectly gauging the resolve of a potential entrant could lead to an expensive, unnecessary commitment. Concluding thoughts. As we conclude this initial exploration, consider this. Are these strategies inherently detrimental to society? Do they stifle innovation and harm consumer welfare? Or do they perhaps incentivize incumbents to maintain efficiency and offer competitive prices to preempt entry? This leads us to a broader question for our next meeting: the role of regulation and antitrust policy in shaping market structure and competition. What principles should guide the policymaker in their attempt to balance the benefits of competition with the potential for strategic behavior and entry deterrence? Ponder this question, dear students, and we shall meet again to continue our intellectual journey. Chapter 2. Defining entry and exit in different markets. Introduction. Having considered the general landscape of strategic interaction in the marketplace, our journey now leads us to more specific considerations, namely, the mechanisms by which established firms attempt to deter potential entrants. We'll explore how these strategies take shape and how market dynamics influence their effectiveness. Think of it: the established firm, rather than maximizing short-term profits, deliberately sets a price lower than what a simple profit maximization model would suggest. The intent? To signal to potential entrants that the market offers insufficient profit margins to justify the investment and risk associated with entering. Imagine a deep, still pool. By artificially lowering the water level, the incumbent hopes to discourage any new streams from flowing in. The effectiveness of limit pricing hinges on several factors. The potential entrant must believe that the incumbent's low price is not a temporary tactic, but a commitment to aggressive competition. This credibility is paramount. If the potential entrant perceives the low price as a temporary bluff, designed to be abandoned once entry occurs, the strategy falters. Furthermore, the cost structures of the incumbent and potential entrant play a crucial role. If the entrant can achieve lower costs, perhaps through innovation or access to cheaper resources, a limit price that deters some may not deter them. There are inherent risks to limit pricing. The incumbent sacrifices immediate profits. It's a strategic investment in future market share, but one that demands careful calculation and unwavering resolve. The classical economist might argue that it is a distortion of the natural market forces, creating an artificial barrier to competition. But the reality of the marketplace is rarely so pristine. Markets, like complex ecosystems, are filled with strategic adaptation. Capacity expansion. Title: Capacity expansion. Building barriers. Content. Another powerful tool in the arsenal of entry deterrence is capacity expansion. Here, the established firm proactively invests in excess production capacity. This serves as a credible threat to potential entrants, a signal that the incumbent possesses the ability to flood the market and drive prices down should entry occur. Think of it as building a dam, not just to contain water, but also to demonstrate the power to unleash a flood. The effectiveness of capacity expansion, like limit pricing, depends on credibility. The potential entrant must believe that the incumbent is genuinely willing to utilize this excess capacity to defend its market share. This credibility can be enhanced by pre-commitment strategies, such as long-term contracts with suppliers or investments in specialized equipment that are difficult to repurpose. The incumbent is, in essence, tying its own hands, demonstrating its unwavering commitment to defending its turf. Of course, holding excess capacity comes at a cost. It requires significant capital investment and ongoing maintenance. The incumbent must carefully weigh the potential benefits of deterring entry against the cost of maintaining this idle capacity. The policymaker might consider whether such strategies, while potentially harmful to consumers in the short run, might foster innovation as the incumbent fights to stay ahead of potential competition. It's a delicate balance. Market variations. Title: Market context and strategic adaptation. Content: The effectiveness of both limit pricing and capacity expansion varies significantly across different market structures. In markets characterized by high product differentiation, the impact of these strategies may be muted. Consumers may be less sensitive to price changes if they perceive significant differences between the incumbent's product and that of a potential entrant. Similarly, In markets with high switching costs, where consumers face significant obstacles to changing suppliers, the incumbent may have more leeway to maintain higher prices without attracting new competition. Conversely, in markets with homogeneous products and low switching costs, the threat of entry is more potent, and the incumbent may need to employ more aggressive entry deterrence strategies. The key is adaptation. The established firm must carefully analyze the specific characteristics of the market and tailor its entry deterrence strategy accordingly. It's like a chameleon, blending into the environment to optimize its survival. Conclusion: we have explored limit pricing and capacity expansion as key strategies employed by established firms to deter entry. These are not static concepts, but rather dynamic tools that must be adapted to the specific context of the market. But what happens when deterrence fails? What are the strategic considerations that guide exit decisions? This is the question we shall navigate in our next phase. Chapter 3. The Threat of Potential Entry. A conceptual overview tonight. We consider a fundamental concept in market structure: the threat of potential entry. Imagine a calm pond. Its surface is smooth, reflecting the evening sky. But just beneath the surface, unseen, are currents generated by the possibility of new life entering the ecosystem. This possibility, the threat of new firms entering a seemingly profitable market, exerts a profound influence on the behavior of established players. It's a pressure, a constraint, that subtly alters their decisions, often leading them to act in ways they wouldn't otherwise choose. The core idea is elegantly simple. Incumbent firms, those already operating within a market, are not immune to future competition. Even in the absence of current rivals, the potential for new firms to emerge and erode their market share looms large. This potential compels incumbents to consider how their actions today will affect the likelihood of entry tomorrow. And from this consideration arises the fascinating field of entry deterrence. Entry deterrence encompasses a range of strategies aimed at discouraging potential competitors from entering a market. These strategies are not always overt. Sometimes, the mere possibility of aggressive action is enough to deter entry. The effectiveness of these strategies depends crucially on the characteristics of the industry, the capabilities of the incumbents, and the expectations of the potential entrants. Two particularly important strategies, limit pricing and capacity expansion, deserve our detailed attention. Let's begin with limit pricing. Think of it as a carefully calibrated balancing act. The classical economist observed long ago that higher prices attract new entrants. Therefore, the incumbent might choose to set a price lower than the profit-maximizing price in the short run. This lower price, known as the limit price, signals to potential entrants that the market is less attractive than it might initially appear. It suggests that profits are already squeezed, that the incumbent is willing and able to defend its market share, and that entry may lead to a costly price war. Of course, limit pricing is not without its drawbacks. By foregoing short-term profits, the incumbent is essentially investing in future market stability. The challenge lies in finding the optimal limit price, one that deters entry without unduly sacrificing current earnings. The calculus becomes even more complex when considering the potential entrants' perceptions. Will they accurately interpret the incumbent's pricing strategy? Or will they see it as a bluff, a temporary tactic that can be overcome? Now, consider the strategic use of capacity. Imagine a vast empty warehouse, a silent testament to potential output. An incumbent firm, particularly one operating in a capital-intensive industry, can strategically invest in excess capacity. This excess capacity acts as a credible commitment to aggressive competition should entry occur. The message is clear. If you enter this market, we have the ability to flood it with output, driving prices down and making your entry unprofitable. The effectiveness of this strategy hinges on its credibility. The potential entrant must believe that the incumbent will actually use the excess capacity if challenged. This credibility is often enhanced by irreversible investments in capacity, sunk costs that cannot be easily recovered. These sunk costs signal the incumbent's long-term commitment to the market and its willingness to defend its position. However, excess capacity also carries a cost. It represents a significant investment that may not be fully utilized if entry does not occur. The incumbent must carefully weigh the benefits of deterring entry against the costs of maintaining unused capacity. Both limit pricing and capacity expansion are powerful tools in the arsenal of entry deterrence. However, their effectiveness depends on a complex interplay of factors, including the specific characteristics of the market, the credibility of the incumbent's commitment, and the expectations of potential entrants. The policymaker, ever watchful, must consider these strategies when evaluating market competition and formulating antitrust policy. The goal is to strike a balance, preventing incumbents from unduly stifling competition while also recognizing the legitimate incentives to invest and innovate. Chapter 4. Foundational Concepts. Economies of Scale and Scope. Entry Deterrence and Strategic Barriers. Welcome back. We've been exploring the fertile landscape of economies of scale and scope, observing how firms cultivate efficiencies to thrive. Now, let's turn our gaze towards the strategic defenses they often erect, the subtle and sometimes overt mechanisms they employ to ward off competitors and maintain their hard-won territory. We're entering the realm of entry deterrence and strategic barriers, specifically focusing on limit pricing and capacity expansion. The question, at its heart, is simple. How do established firms convince potential rivals that entering their market is an exercise in futility? Imagine a tranquil lake, perfectly balanced. A well-established firm sits as the master of this ecosystem, drawing sustenance and maintaining equilibrium. But the prospect of a new species, a rival firm, appearing on the horizon disrupts this balance. The existing firm, naturally, wants to preserve its position. This is where the concept of entry deterrence comes into play. One potent tool in this defense is limit pricing. The classical economist understood this intuitively. Limit pricing involves setting a price lower than what a monopolist would normally charge, a price low enough to discourage new entrants. It's a delicate dance. The incumbent forgoes some short-term profit to signal to potential entrants that the market is already saturated, the margins are thin, and the struggle for market share will be a costly and protracted affair. Think of it as a carefully calibrated current in our tranquil lake, strong enough to discourage newcomers, yet not so violent as to deplete the existing resources. The signal transmitted by the low price implies that any new entrant would be unable to achieve sufficient profitability to justify the initial investment and ongoing costs of operation. The policymaker often grapples with the nuances of limit pricing, trying to distinguish it from predatory pricing, which involves setting prices below cost with the explicit intention of driving existing competitors out of the market. The line can be blurry, requiring careful consideration of the firm's costs, market structure, and long-term strategy. Now, let's consider the strategic barrier of capacity expansion. This strategy involves the incumbent firm investing in substantial excess capacity, essentially building a larger facility than currently needed to meet existing demand. This serves as a credible threat. Should a new firm dare to enter the market, the incumbent can rapidly increase production and flood the market, driving prices down and making life exceedingly difficult for the newcomer. Envision a dam strategically placed at the lake's outlet. It represents the incumbent's capacity. A potential entrant, seeing this vast reservoir of potential supply, understands that the incumbent can unleash a torrent of product at any moment, effectively drowning the newcomer's fledgling operations. This is not merely theoretical. The act of investing in excess capacity acts as a commitment, a signal to potential entrants that the incumbent is serious about defending its market share and possesses the resources to do so. But consider the other side of the equation. Maintaining excess capacity is not without cost. It requires significant upfront investment and ongoing maintenance expenses. The incumbent must weigh these costs against the potential benefits of deterring entry. If the threat of entry is low, or if the costs of capacity expansion are prohibitively high, the incumbent may choose a different strategy, perhaps one of accommodation or even collaboration. The decision to employ limit pricing or capacity expansion is a complex one, dependent on a myriad of factors including the elasticity of demand, the cost structure of potential entrants, the regulatory environment, and the incumbent's own risk appetite. It's a sophisticated interplay of strategy, economics, and psychology. These tools, limit pricing and capacity expansion, are not foolproof. They rely on rational actors responding predictably to signals and incentives. But the business world is rarely so clean. Furthermore, over time, the barriers to entry themselves may erode, weakened by technological advancements or shifts in consumer preferences. The lake, though seemingly protected, is subject to the forces of nature and the relentless march of time. And as we consider these strategic defenses, a question lingers. What happens when the walls fall? What new economic structures arise from the ashes of old monopolies? We'll navigate these shifting sands in our next exploration. Core principles of game theory. Nash equilibrium and subgame perfection. Ah, yes. We've laid the groundwork, considered the individual actors in their isolated pursuits. Now, we gently wade into the swirling currents of strategic interaction. We move beyond simple optimization and enter the realm where your best move depends on what they think your best move is. Tonight, we'll explore Nash equilibrium and subgame perfection, two core navigational stars in the landscape of game theory, and then apply these principles to the strategic dance of entry deterrence. Nash equilibrium, at its heart, represents a state of stability. Think of it as a balanced ecosystem. No individual organism, acting rationally and in its own self-interest, has an incentive to deviate from its current behavior, given the behaviors of all the other organisms in the system. It's not necessarily the best outcome for everyone, mind you. It's simply the outcome where everyone is doing the best they can, considering what everyone else is doing. Imagine a perfectly still pond. A stone dropped creates ripples, disturbing the equilibrium. Nash equilibrium is the state the pond returns to, the eventual stillness, when all the ripples have subsided. However, Nash equilibrium can sometimes be a bit naive. It can fail to account for the sequential nature of many strategic interactions. This is where subgame perfection enters the picture. Subgame perfection refines the concept of Nash equilibrium by requiring that strategies form a Nash equilibrium in every possible subgame of the larger game. A subgame is simply a smaller game that begins at a decision node within the larger game. Consider a chess match. Every move creates a new subgame, a new set of potential paths. Subgame perfection demands that your strategy be optimal, not just overall, but at every single fork in the road. Now, let's apply these powerful lenses to the fascinating world of entry deterrence. Imagine an established firm, comfortably nestled in its market share, facing the looming threat of a new competitor. What strategies can it employ to discourage entry? This is where limit pricing and capacity come into play, acting as strategic barriers. Limit pricing involves the established firm setting a price low enough to make entry unprofitable for a potential entrant. The classical economist might argue that this is a purely competitive outcome, simply responding to market forces. But the game theorist sees something more, a deliberate signaling mechanism. The incumbent firm, by accepting lower profits now, attempts to convince the potential entrant that post-entry profits will be even lower, thus deterring them from entering the market at all. It's a delicate balancing act. The incumbent must lower its price enough to deter entry, but not so low as to sacrifice too much of its own profit. Capacity, on the other hand, works as a credible commitment. The incumbent firm invests in excess production capacity, signaling to potential entrants that it is prepared to aggressively increase output should they dare to enter. This commitment is credible because the capacity is already in place. The firm can easily activate it. Think of it as a slumbering giant, capable of awakening and crushing any challenger. The policymaker, however, might view this strategy with a wary eye. While it might deter entry and keep prices low in the short term, it could also stifle innovation and long-term efficiency. The line between strategic advantage and anti-competitive behavior can be blurry. These strategies, limit pricing and capacity expansion, are not merely about short-term profit maximization. They are about shaping the expectations of potential entrants and altering the future landscape of the market. They are about creating a system where the threat of competition is often more powerful than actual competition itself. These strategies hinge on credible commitments, on signals that are costly and difficult to fake. The entrant must believe that the incumbent will actually carry out the threatened actions if entry occurs. If the entrant perceives the threat as empty, the strategy will fail. As we drift towards the end of our discussion tonight, consider this. How does the presence of multiple potential entrants alter the strategic calculus? Does the existence of many smaller challengers embolden them, or does it make each one more hesitant to challenge the incumbent? This lingering question, this subtle shift in perspective, is where we'll begin our exploration next time, as we delve deeper into the complexities of competitive landscapes. Chapter 6. The classic Bain-Silas-Labini model of limit pricing. Welcome back. We've journeyed through the landscape of market structures, observing how the number of firms and the nature of competition shape the price of goods and services. Now, we turn our attention to a fascinating facet of the market, the strategic dance of entry deterrence. Specifically, we'll explore the limit pricing model, a cornerstone of understanding how established firms attempt to ward off potential rival. This chapter will focus on the elegant simplicity of the classical Bain-Silas-Labini model, a foundational piece that has informed decades of economic thinking. Imagine a serene pond, already inhabited by a dominant swan. This swan, of course, represents an established firm in a given market. The swan holds territory, enjoys a certain level of tranquility, and is well situated to exploit the food resources of the lake. Now, the question arises, what would discourage other swans from joining the pond and competing for those same resources? That's the central question of entry deterrence. Limit pricing, at its heart, is a proactive measure. It suggests that an established firm might deliberately set its price below the level that would maximize its short-term profits. The rationale is beautifully simple. By charging a lower price, the limit price, the established firm aims to signal to potential entrants that the market is less profitable than it might initially appear. This reduced profitability lowers the incentive for entry, acting as a subtle but potentially powerful barrier. The Bain-Silas-Labini model provides a formal framework for this intuition. It assumes that potential entrants believe that the incumbent firm will maintain its current output level, even after entry occurs. This is a crucial assumption, often termed the silos postulate. Under this assumption, the potential entrant assesses the residual demand curve, that is, the demand remaining after the incumbent has supplied its output. If the potential entrant believes that, even by entering at its most efficient scale, the resulting market price would be too low to cover its costs, it will rationally choose to stay out. The incumbent firm, anticipating this behavior, can then strategically choose an output level and associated price that simultaneously deters entry and provides a reasonable level of profit. Consider the perspective of the classical economist, observing this interplay. He sees the established firm carefully balancing the immediate gains from higher prices with the long-term benefit of maintaining market dominance. The limit price, in this sense, becomes a kind of truce line. It's not necessarily the best price for the incumbent in the short run, but it offers the most attractive path to sustain profitability. The model is not without its limitations, of course. The silos postulate itself has been subject to much debate. Is it really plausible to assume that the established firm will passively maintain its output in the face of new competition? Might the incumbent not respond aggressively, engaging in a price war or other strategies to drive the entrant out? This brings us to questions regarding the credibility of limit pricing as a long-run competitive strategy. Furthermore, the model assumes that potential entrants have perfect information about the incumbent's costs and the market demand. In reality, such information is often incomplete or asymmetric, leading to potential miscalculations. Uncertainty regarding future market conditions, technological change, and regulatory shifts can further complicate the decision-making process. Despite these limitations, the Bain-Silas-Labini model remains a valuable starting point for understanding the economics of entry deterrence. It provides a clear and concise framework for analyzing the strategic incentives that influence pricing decisions in imperfectly competitive markets. It is also crucial when the policymaker is attempting to regulate such markets to ensure the consumer benefits from a competitive market. As we move forward, we will delve into more sophisticated models of entry deterrence, considering issues such as capacity investment, reputation effects, and the role of incomplete information. We will also examine how the assumptions of the Bain-Silas-Labini model can be relaxed to create more realistic and nuanced analyses. Before we do that, though, is the idea of limit pricing always a successful deterrent? What if the perceived gains are high enough for the entrant to take the risk? Chapter 7. Understanding cost advantages and disadvantages in limit pricing. Having explored the theoretical landscape of limit pricing, our journey now takes us into the practical realm of cost structures, those underlying forces that dictate a firm's ability to effectively wield the weapon of entry deter. Limit pricing, as we understand, hinges on the incumbent firm setting a price low enough to discourage potential entrants. However, the feasibility of such a strategy is inextricably linked to the incumbent's cost structure. A firm with significant cost advantages can sustain a low price while maintaining profitability, effectively squeezing out less efficient competitors. Conversely, a firm burdened by cost disadvantages may find itself in a precarious position, unable to credibly commit to a limit pricing strategy. Let's begin by considering the sources of cost advantages. These can be manifold. Perhaps the most straightforward is economies of scale. Larger firms, through sheer volume of production, can often spread fixed costs over a greater number of units, resulting in a lower average cost per unit. This allows them to offer lower prices without sacrificing profit margins. Think of it as a vast river, its initial trickle requiring considerable effort, but its eventual mass flowing with ease and power. Another source of advantage lies in superior technology or production processes. A firm that has invested in cutting-edge technology or developed innovative ways to streamline its operations can produce goods or services at a lower cost than its rivals. This technological edge acts as a shield, deflecting competitive pressures. Furthermore, access to cheaper raw materials or labor can also confer a significant cost advantage. A firm located near abundant natural resources or in a region with lower labor costs can reduce its overall production expenses, thereby enhancing its ability to engage in limit pricing. It's the difference between building a house with readily available lumber and one that requires materials shipped from afar. Now, let's turn our attention to the disadvantages. A firm operating with outdated technology or inefficient production processes will naturally face higher costs. It's like navigating a ship with tattered sails, struggling against the wind while others glide effortlessly. Moreover, a firm might be locked into long-term contracts with suppliers that stipulate higher prices than those available on the open market. These contractual obligations can act as an anchor, preventing the firm from adjusting its cost structure to meet competitive pressure. Organizational inefficiencies can also contribute to higher costs. A bloated bureaucracy, excessive layers of management, or a lack of coordination between departments can all drive up expenses. This internal friction dissipates energy, hindering the firm's ability to compete effectively. Consider the implications for the classical economist, observing the interplay of forces within the market. A firm enjoying significant cost advantages might choose to engage in aggressive limit pricing, sacrificing short-term profits to secure its long-term dominance. This is a rational strategy, designed to deter entry and maintain a larger market share. The policymaker, on the other hand, might view this situation with a critical eye. While lower prices benefit consumers in the short run, excessive market power can lead to higher prices and reduced innovation in the long run. The challenge lies in striking a balance between promoting competition and allowing firms to reap the rewards of their efficiency. Capacity, as previously implied, plays a crucial role. A firm with excess capacity can credibly threaten to flood the market with output if a new entrant dares to challenge its position. This threat, backed by the ability to increase production without incurring significant additional costs, can be a powerful deterrent. However, maintaining excess capacity comes at a cost. The firm must invest in resources that are not fully utilized, a potential drain on profitability. In essence, the success of limit pricing as a strategy depends on a careful assessment of both the incumbent's own cost structure and that of potential entrants. A firm with a clear cost advantage is in a much stronger position to credibly commit to a low-price strategy. But even a firm with disadvantages isn't necessarily defeated. Creative management and innovative process improvements can sometimes overcome inherent weaknesses. The market, after all, is a dynamic and ever-shifting landscape. As we conclude this chapter, consider this: how do firms strategically manipulate their cost structures, investing in advantages and mitigating disadvantages, to enhance their ability to deter entry and maintain market power? This question sets the stage for our next exploration, where we delve into the specific tactics firms employ to strategically shape their cost positions. Chapter 8: Critiques and Limitations of Early Limit Pricing Theories. We've journeyed through the initial conceptualization of limit pricing, the idea that incumbent firms strategically lower their prices to deter potential entrants. Now, like a gardener carefully examining the health of their plants, we must turn a critical eye to the limitations and criticisms levied against these early theories. We must assess their strengths and acknowledge their frailties. The initial models, elegant in their simplicity, often assumed a world of near-perfect information. Everyone knew, or could accurately anticipate, the cost structures of both the incumbent and the potential entrant. This created a neat deterministic system where the incumbent could calculate precisely the maximum price it could charge without attracting new competition. But, as is often the case, the real world is far messier. One of the primary critiques revolved around the credibility of the threat. Consider this: the strategy of limit pricing requires the incumbent firm to willingly sacrifice short-term profits. It must maintain a price below the monopoly level, foregoing potential revenue in the present, all in the hope of avoiding future competition. However, once the entrant has actually committed, once the factory is built, the marketing team assembled, and the distribution network established, what prevents the incumbent from simply raising prices? It's a question of commitment, a question of signaling to the market that this lower price isn't a temporary tactic, but a long-term strategy. Economists question the rationale behind this sacrifice. If, after entry, the incumbent were to revert to a more profitable pricing strategy, the initial investment in limit pricing would seem wasteful, a sunk cost with little enduring benefit. This time, inconsistency problem cast a long shadow over the early theories. The promise of low prices, meant to deter entrants, might simply be seen as an empty threat. Another significant challenge emerged from the inherent complexities of real-world cost structures. The early models often painted a stark picture. Incumbents enjoyed a clear and decisive cost advantage. They possessed proprietary technology, economies of scale unavailable to newcomers, or superior management expertise. However, in many industries, cost differences are far more nuanced, far more blurred. Entrants might, for instance, bring innovative business models, exploit overlooked niches, or possess superior access to specific resources. Moreover, focusing solely on price as the deterrent ignored the multifaceted nature of competition. A potential entrant isn't just evaluating the current price level, it's considering the overall market landscape, brand loyalty, product differentiation, regulatory hurdles, and the potential for future innovation. To focus solely on price is like trying to understand the flow of a river by only measuring its depth at a single point. Further, the perfect information assumption was profoundly unrealistic. Potential entrants rarely possess complete knowledge of the incumbent's cost structure, let alone its strategic intentions. Uncertainty reigns, clouding judgment and introducing a substantial element of risk into the entry decision. The classical economist, confident in his assumptions, often overlooked the human element, the inherent risk aversion, the biases, and the incomplete information that shape real-world decision-making. The policymaker, attempting to regulate industries based on these early models, faced a daunting task, navigating a sea of imperfect data and uncertain outcomes. Consider, too, that these early theories often treated potential entrants as monolithic entities, homogeneous and interchangeable. But, in reality, entrants come in all shapes and sizes. Small startups, well-funded corporations from related industries, or even foreign firms seeking new markets. Each faces unique challenges and possesses distinct strategic options. A one-size-fits-all theory of entry deterrence, therefore, proved insufficient to capture the diversity of real-world competitive dynamics. These critiques, while challenging the initial simplicity of limit pricing theories, didn't invalidate the underlying concept entirely. Rather, they served as a catalyst for further research, prompting economists to develop more sophisticated models that incorporated the complexities of imperfect information, strategic commitment, and heterogeneous entrants. The tide had turned, revealing the sandbars beneath the surface of the initial models. So, where does this leave us? We've seen the initial elegance of limit pricing theories and the subsequent wave of criticism that exposed their limitations. But what refinements followed? How did economists address these shortcomings and develop more nuanced models of entry deterrence? This is the path we must now explore, the continuing evolution of our understanding of strategic barriers to entry. Chapter 9. Introduction to Capacity as a Strategic Variable. Good evening. We've spent our time together thus far exploring the foundational principles of market structure, pricing, and competitive behavior. We've considered how firms, driven by the invisible hand, navigate the currents of supply and demand, seeking equilibrium in a world of imperfect information. Tonight, we delve into a more strategic realm, a realm where firms not only react to market forces, but actively shape them to their advantage. We'll consider the role of capacity not just as a static measure of production potential, but as a dynamic, strategic variable in the complex game of entry deterrence. Think of a river. The steady flow represents demand. A small dam represents a firm's production capacity. But what happens when a new tributary threatens to join the flow, a new entrant seeking to carve out its own share of the water? The existing dam owner, the incumbent, has choices. And those choices, thoughtfully considered and implemented, can determine whether the new tributary ever connects at all. The central question we'll address is this: how can a firm use its capacity, its ability to produce, to credibly deter potential entrants from entering its market? The answers lead us to fascinating concepts like limit pricing and the strategic creation of barriers to entry. These aren't merely tactical maneuvers. They represent long-term strategic investments aimed at shaping the very structure of the industry. Now, let's consider limit pricing. This is a deceptively simple concept. The incumbent firm deliberately sets its price below the short-run profit-maximizing level. The rationale: by accepting lower profits now, the incumbent signals to potential entrants that profitability in the market is limited. It paints a picture of thin margins and fierce competition, discouraging those on the sidelines from investing in the costly process of entering the market. Imagine the incumbent as a seasoned chess player, sacrificing a pawn early in the game to secure a more advantageous position in the endgame. The sacrificed profit, the lower price, is that pawn. It's a calculated risk designed to yield a larger payoff in the long run: the preservation of market share and the avoidance of costly competition. However, the effectiveness of limit pricing hinges on credibility. The potential entrant needs to believe that the incumbent will maintain the low price even after entry occurs. If the entrant anticipates that the incumbent will simply raise prices once competition emerges, the limit price loses its deterrent effect. This is where capacity enters the picture as a strategic weapon. Consider a scenario where the incumbent has invested in excess capacity. It has the potential to produce far more than it is currently selling. This excess capacity serves as a powerful signal. It demonstrates to potential entrants that the incumbent has the ability to flood the market with additional supply should entry occur. The threat of a price war, driven by this readily available capacity, becomes much more credible. The incumbent, in essence, is saying, "Enter at your own peril. I have the resources to make your entry unprofitable." This credible threat, embodied in the physical reality of unused production potential, is a significant barrier to entry. Think of it like a large, imposing fortress guarding a city. The walls and ramparts represent the incumbent's existing market share. But the cannons within, the unused production capacity, represent the firm's capacity to retaliate against any attempted invasion. The mere presence of those cannons can be enough to deter potential attackers. Of course, building and maintaining excess capacity is costly. It requires significant upfront investment. The incumbent must carefully weigh the costs of this investment against the potential benefits of deterring entry. The decision hinges on a thorough understanding of the market, the potential entrants, and the long-term strategic implications of maintaining a credible deterrent. Furthermore, the effectiveness of capacity as a deterrent depends on the specific characteristics of the industry. In some industries where capital costs are high and demand is relatively inelastic, excess capacity can be a particularly potent weapon. In others, where entry costs are low and innovation is rapid, it may be less effective. Thus, the strategic use of capacity isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. It requires a nuanced understanding of the market, a careful assessment of the competitive landscape, and a willingness to make long-term strategic investments. It's a delicate balancing act, a constant calibration of production potential against the ever-present threat of new competition. And so, as we conclude this chapter, consider this. If the strategic use of capacity is about shaping market structure, about erecting barriers to entry, what happens when those barriers crumble? What happens when technological innovation or disruptive forces render existing capacity obsolete, leaving even the most fortified incumbent vulnerable to the winds of change? This, perhaps, is the question that will guide our exploration in the chapters to come. Chapter 10. Spence-Dixit Model. Pre-commitment and capacity expansion. Consider for a moment a tranquil pond. An established ecosystem thrives. Then, a new species appears, threatening the delicate balance. The existing inhabitants have a choice: adapt, compete, or prevent the intrusion altogether. In the realm of economics, this preventative strategy is known as entry deterrence. The traditional models we've explored often treated capacity as a consequence of production decisions. The firm decides how much to produce, and that implicitly defines its capacity. But what if capacity itself becomes a strategic tool? What if a firm deliberately overinvests in capacity, not to satisfy current demand, but to signal to potential entrants that competition will be fierce and unprofitable? This is the essence of the Spence-Dixit model, a framework that explores how a firm can use pre-commitment to capacity expansion as a credible threat to deter entry. Imagine a coastal town building a formidable seawall. The purpose isn't merely to protect against current storms, but to demonstrate resilience against future, potentially larger, deluges. The core idea rests on the concept of sunk costs. Capacity, once built, becomes a sunk cost. It represents an investment that cannot easily be recovered. This irreversibility is crucial because it makes the incumbent firm's commitment credible. The classical economist might argue that rational firms would only invest in capacity that is currently profitable, but the Spence-Dixit model challenges this assumption. The reasoning is as follows. A potential entrant, considering whether to enter the market, will analyze the post-entry scenario. They'll estimate the expected profits, taking into account the likely response of the incumbent firm. If the incumbent firm already has a large capacity, the entrant will anticipate aggressive price competition. The incumbent can credibly threaten to flood the market with output, driving prices down to levels that make entry unprofitable. The key here is the concept of subgame perfection. The incumbent firm's commitment to maintaining high output, even if it means sacrificing some short-term profit, must be credible in the post-entry game. The large capacity serves as a visible, tangible signal of this commitment. It's akin to a chess player sacrificing a pawn early in the game to establish a stronger strategic position later. Furthermore, the effectiveness of this strategy depends on the entrant's beliefs about the incumbent's cost structure. If the entrant believes that the incumbent has very low costs, even a moderate capacity expansion might be enough to deter entry. Conversely, if the entrant believes that the incumbent has high costs, a more substantial investment in capacity may be required. The Spence-Dixit model also sheds light on the role of government policy. The policymaker might consider interventions to limit the ability of incumbent firms to engage in such strategic capacity expansion. However, there are potential downsides to such interventions. Preventing firms from investing in capacity could also stifle innovation and efficiency. Finding the right balance is a delicate act, akin to calibrating a sensitive instrument. Limit pricing, a related concept, involves the incumbent setting a price so low that it makes entry unattractive. This price is below the short-run profit-maximizing price, but above the incumbent's cost. The difference acts as insurance, safeguarding the market from new entrants. The strategic use of capacity expansion and limit pricing highlights the complexities of competition. It demonstrates that firms can influence the market landscape, not only through their current actions, but also through their strategic commitments for the future. It's a reminder that economic decisions are not made in isolation, but rather within a dynamic system of interdependent actors. Chapter 11. Examining first-mover advantages and entry deterrence. Last time, we explored the delicate dance of oligopolies, the few firms that shape a market's destiny. Tonight, we delve deeper, examining how established firms, like ancient gatekeepers, can strategically discourage newcomers from joining their walled garden. This is the realm of entry deterrence, a fascinating intersection of market power and strategic foresight. At its core, entry deterrence is about creating barriers, not literal walls of course, but rather economic obstacles that make it unprofitable, or at least excessively risky, for potential competitors to enter a market. These barriers can be structural, inherent to the market's nature, or they can be strategically erected by incumbent firms. Tonight, we'll focus on the latter, specifically, limit pricing and capacity expansion. Let us begin with limit pricing. Imagine a lone artisan, the sole provider of finely crafted clocks in a small village. If he prices his clocks high, maximizing his immediate profit, he risks attracting another artisan to the village, one who might undercut his prices and steal away his customers. Limit pricing is akin to the artisan cautiously lowering his price, accepting a slightly lower profit margin now, to signal to any potential competitors that the market is already saturated and unprofitable to enter. This strategy rests on a crucial assumption that potential entrants perceive the current price as an indication of the incumbent's future pricing behavior. It is a subtle dance of information, a suggestion whispered across the economic landscape. The classical economist would argue that this strategy only works if the potential entrant is relatively naive, assuming that the current price reflects long-run costs. A more sophisticated entrant would analyze the incumbent's cost structure and demand curve, realizing that a higher price might be sustainable once they are locked into the market. Now, consider the strategic use of capacity. Imagine a manufacturing plant, capable of producing far more goods than are currently demanded. This seemingly wasteful excess capacity can be a potent deterrent. It signals to potential entrants that the incumbent firm is ready and able to flood the market with goods should a competitor attempt to gain a foothold. This commitment to maintaining excess capacity is not without its costs. The incumbent must invest in the infrastructure and bear the associated overhead. However, the potential payoff, the continued dominance of the market, can often justify the expense. The policymaker, in attempting to regulate such behavior, must tread carefully. Intervening too aggressively might stifle innovation and efficiency, while inaction could allow incumbents to stifle competition and harm consumers. Both limit pricing and capacity expansion rely on the concept of credible commitment. A threat is only effective if it is believable. The incumbent must convince potential entrants that they are willing and able to follow through on their strategy, even if it means sacrificing short-term profits. This credibility can be enhanced through investments in specific assets, which are difficult to redeploy to other uses, or through reputation effects built up over time. A firm known for aggressively defending its market share is less likely to be challenged in the first place. It's important to note that the effectiveness of these strategies depends heavily on the characteristics of the industry. Industries with high fixed costs, significant economies of scale, and strong brand loyalty are more conducive to entry deterrence. Conversely, industries with low barriers to entry, rapidly changing technology, and fragmented customer bases are more difficult to protect. Ultimately, the decision to employ entry deterrence strategies is a complex one, involving careful analysis of costs, benefits, and risks. It is a game of chess, played on the board of the marketplace, where the stakes are nothing less than market dominance. And like any game of chess, the best strategy depends on the specific circumstances and the opponent's moves. But does this then encourage a spiral of strategic behavior? If entry deterrence is a common practice, does it then not encourage firms to disguise their true intentions, adding a layer of uncertainty and risk to the decision-making process for both incumbents and potential entrants? That, perhaps, is a question to ponder as we move to the next stage of our exploration. Chapter 12. The role of irreversible investments and sunk costs. Tonight, we transition from our discussion of observable price strategies to a perhaps subtler but equally compelling aspect of strategic competition: the power of irreversible investments and the burden of sunk costs. Recall how firms, in the face of potential entrants, might manipulate prices. Now, let us consider how a firm's commitment to tangible assets can reshape the competitive landscape. Think of it as moving beyond price wars and building fortresses. Sunk costs, by definition, are those expenditures that cannot be recovered upon exiting a market. They are the anchor dragging along the seabed of commerce. These costs represent investments specific to a particular industry or location, leaving a firm irrevocably bound to its chosen path. This commitment, while potentially lucrative, also introduces a vulnerability. Once committed, exiting becomes expensive. The value of the investment is lost to the waves. Consider a specialized manufacturing plant. It might churn out goods efficiently, but its value vanishes if the firm decides to shift its focus. Irreversible investments, often closely intertwined with sunk costs, further complicate the game. These are investments that lose significant value if redeployed to alternative uses. Imagine a high-speed rail line connecting two cities. The rails cannot easily become roads, nor the specialized rolling stock become anything else. The magnitude of such investments acts as a signal, a declaration of long-term intent, a bold, unwavering bet on the future. It's a demonstration of faith in the market, but also a formidable barrier to entry. How, then, do these concepts tie into entry deterrence? A firm contemplating entry must assess not only the current market conditions, but also the potential for retaliation from incumbent firm. If the incumbent has made significant, irreversible investments, especially in capacity, the potential entrant understands that the incumbent has skin in the game. The incumbent is unlikely to surrender market share without a fight, a prolonged and potentially costly price war. Let us consider the strategy of limit pricing. In its simplest form, this involves setting a price low enough to discourage entry, even if it means sacrificing short-term profits. The classical economist might argue this is inherently irrational. Why forgo profits today for a potential threat tomorrow? However, when coupled with substantial capacity investments, limit pricing becomes a far more credible threat. The policymaker can now point to the existing infrastructure and declare, "We are ready to flood the market, should you dare to enter." The potential entrant sees not only a low price, but also the inherent ability of the incumbent to sustain that low price for an extended period. This is not merely a temporary dip. It's a commitment to a long-term defense. The key is credibility. A mere threat of price cuts is rarely sufficient. An entrant might reasonably assume that the incumbent is bluffing. However, a firm that has demonstrably built excess capacity, a larger plant, a more extensive distribution network, sends a much stronger signal. The capacity itself becomes a tangible weapon, a readily available arsenal. This strategy, sometimes termed preemptive capacity expansion, involves building capacity ahead of actual demand, signaling to potential rivals that any attempt to enter the market will be met with fierce resistance. Think of it as a strategic moat, not filled with water, but with the very means of production. However, this strategy is not without its risks. Building excess capacity requires a substantial upfront investment. If demand fails to materialize, or if the threat of entry dissipates, the incumbent may find itself saddled with underutilized assets and lower profits. The investment acts as a commitment to future production, meaning the incumbent must sell more products to recover the cost of investment. Furthermore, the strategy may even attract entry, as it might be interpreted as a sign of high demand growth. The economic tides can change unexpectedly, so the planner must take caution when implementing these long-term changes. The strategic use of irreversible investments and sunk costs, therefore, is a delicate balancing act. It requires a deep understanding of market dynamics, competitor behavior, and the potential for technological change. It's a game of chess played not just with prices, but with the very fabric of production. It forces us to ponder: how long will this investment stand, and what new threat will emerge over the horizon? Consider also what factors will determine the overall value of this investment. And so, as we begin to consider the next phase in our exploration of market dynamics, let us pause to ponder how the commitment to sunk costs might inadvertently shape the very future they are intended to protect. What new forms of flexibility and adaptation might firms need to cultivate in an era of accelerating change to escape the gravity of irreversible commitments? Our journey continues. Chapter 13. Strategic Complements and Strategic Substitutes. Impact on Entry. Welcome back. As we gently navigated the complexities of network effects in our previous session, we touched upon the inherent power dynamics that shape markets. Tonight, we delve deeper into these power plays, focusing specifically on how established firms strategically attempt to deter new entrants. Think of it as a delicate dance, a game of chess played not with pieces of ivory, but with production quotas and price points. The core concept underpinning entry deterrence lies in altering the very landscape of the market to make it less appealing, or even outright hostile, to potential newcomers. Two powerful tools in this arsenal are limit pricing and excess capacity. Before we examine these strategies, however, it's crucial to understand the nuanced interaction between firms' actions. Are they strategic complements or strategic substitutes? The answer influences the outcome substantially. Imagine two established players in a duopoly. Their actions are strategic complements when one firm's aggressive move prompts the other to respond in kind, escalating the competitive pressure. A price war, for example, is often a consequence of strategic complementarity. If one firm lowers its price, the other must follow suit to maintain its market share. The result is mutually destructive, lowering profits for everyone involved. Conversely, their actions are strategic substitutes if one firm's aggressive move prompts the other to retreat, to accommodate the action. For example, if one firm increases its output substantially, the other firm may choose to reduce its output to avoid a glut in the market and a dramatic price decline. Now, let us consider limit pricing. This strategy involves an established firm setting its price low, deliberately below the profit-maximizing level in the short run. The aim is to signal to potential entrants that the market is already saturated, that profits are slim, and that entry would be unprofitable. It's akin to setting a "do not disturb" sign on the door to the market. The classical economist of old might argue this strategy is irrational. Why sacrifice immediate profits? Because our shrewd incumbent anticipates that the long-run benefit of deterring entry, maintaining its dominant market position, outweighs the short-term loss. The policymaker, however, is often wary of limit pricing, suspecting it may simply be a veiled attempt to monopolize the market, stifling innovation and consumer welfare. Excess capacity is another powerful weapon. An established firm can deliberately maintain a production capacity far exceeding its current output. This demonstrates to potential entrants that the incumbent has the ability to significantly increase production, and therefore lower prices, should anyone dare to challenge its position. It's the economic equivalent of flexing one's muscles. Maintaining this spare capacity comes at a cost, of course. But, again, the long-term benefit of discouraging entry can justify the investment. The threat of flooding the market with product is a powerful deterrent, especially if entrants require significant capital investment to even begin production. Whether limit pricing or excess capacity are truly effective depends on several factors. The entrant's perception of the incumbent's costs, the entrant's financial resources, and the overall market demand all play a role. If the entrant believes the incumbent's costs are high, it may dismiss the low price as unsustainable. If the entrant has deep pockets, it may be willing to weather a period of low prices to gain market share. And if market demand is growing rapidly, there may be room for both the incumbent and the entrant to thrive. It's a complex interplay, a delicate balance of threat and calculation. The strategic decision to deter entry is never taken lightly. It requires careful analysis of the market, the potential entrants, and the incumbent's own capabilities. The challenge for the firm lies in credibly communicating its commitment to defending its market share, even at a cost. It's about crafting a narrative that instills caution in the hearts of would-be competitors. As we slowly drift towards the close of this chapter, let us consider one final lingering question. What happens when these strategic barriers themselves become targets? What strategies do entrants deploy to overcome these carefully constructed defenses? That, my friends, is a topic for our next encounter, as we continue our exploration of the fascinating landscape of competitive strategy. Good night. Signaling and entry deterrence. Building a reputation. We've previously explored the static world of limit pricing, where an incumbent firm sets a price low enough to deter potential entrants. Now, let's consider how this static strategy evolves in a dynamic setting. Imagine a river, once dammed by a simple barrier. Over time, the pressure of the water builds, testing the dam's strength. Similarly, a firm seeking to deter entry must continually reinforce its defenses, not just with pricing, but also by building a reputation. Consider a series of periods. In each period, a potential entrant observes the incumbent's actions and then decides whether or not to enter the market. The incumbent, knowing this, can use its actions in early periods to influence the entrant's beliefs about its future behavior. This is the essence of signaling in entry deterrence. It's no longer about simply setting a low price today. It's about creating an expectation of continued low prices tomorrow and the day after. The key here is information asymmetry. The potential entrant is uncertain about the incumbent's costs or its commitment to deterring entry. Maybe the incumbent has secretly low production costs, enabling it to withstand price wars. Or perhaps, the incumbent is simply more aggressive, more willing to accept short-term losses to maintain its dominant position. The incumbent's actions serve as signals, revealing, or attempting to conceal, its true nature. One potent signal is predatory pricing. The incumbent aggressively lowers its prices, even below its own costs, in response to entry, or even the threat of entry. This sends a clear message: if you enter, I will fight you fiercely. But predatory pricing is a risky strategy. It's costly for the incumbent, and it may not be credible if the entrant believes the incumbent will eventually relent. The entrant might think this is just a temporary tactic. Once I establish a foothold, they'll raise prices again. To make predatory pricing credible, the incumbent needs to build a reputation for toughness. It needs to demonstrate a willingness to engage in price wars, even when it hurts. Think of it as a commitment device, a way to tie one's hands and force oneself to act in a way that might seem irrational in the short term, but it is rational in the long run. Capacity expansion can also be a powerful signal. An incumbent firm invests in excess capacity, sending the message that it is ready to increase production and drive down prices if a new firm enters. This excess capacity acts as a credible threat. The potential entrant sees the idle factories and understands that the incumbent has the resources to flood the market with product if challenged. This, too, is a costly signal. Building and maintaining excess capacity ties up capital and incurs ongoing expenses. However, the effectiveness of these signals depends on the potential entrant's beliefs and rationality. If the entrant is overly optimistic or misinterprets the incumbent's actions, the signal may fail. Furthermore, the incumbent must weigh the costs of signaling against the benefits of deterring entry. A costly signal might deter entry, but it could also erode the incumbent's own profits. The policymaker faces a challenge when observing these strategies. Is the incumbent engaging in legitimate competition, or is it attempting to stifle innovation and harm consumers through anti-competitive practices? Distinguishing between these two scenarios is often difficult, requiring careful analysis of the firm's costs, pricing behavior, and market structure. Overly aggressive intervention could stifle beneficial competition, while insufficient intervention could allow anti-competitive behavior to flourish. Consider this reputation building as balancing beams. The incumbent must balance its reputation against the costs of establishing that reputation. The potential entrant must balance its desire for profit against the risks of entering. And the policymaker must balance the need to protect consumers against the risks of stifling competition. It's a delicate equilibrium. As we transition into our next exploration, a question lingers. If signals can be manipulated, can we truly trust the information that firms convey, or are we perpetually navigating a landscape of strategic deception? What tools do we have to discern true intention from carefully constructed facade? Chapter 15. The importance of information asymmetry in entry games. Good evening. Settle in. Let your thoughts become as still as a mountain lake, reflecting the twilight sky. Tonight, we consider the fascinating world of entry deterrence, focusing particularly on the crucial role of information asymmetry. Imagine a tranquil game of chess, but one where neither player can fully see the other's pieces. This, in essence, is the situation facing firms considering entering an established market. The theoretical underpinnings of entry deterrence often hinge on the concept of strategic barriers. These aren't merely accidental hurdles, like geographic isolation. They are deliberately erected fortifications, built to dissuade potential competitors from even attempting to breach the market walls. Two primary strategic weapons in this arsenal are limit pricing and capacity building. Let's examine each, keeping information asymmetry firmly in mind. Consider limit pricing. The established firm, already entrenched, might deliberately set its price below the short-run profit-maximizing level. Why? To signal to potential entrants that the market is already saturated and that any attempt to compete will result in painful losses for all involved. The classical economist might argue this is a clear sign of market inefficiency, a distortion of optimal resource allocation. However, the incumbent views it as a necessary investment in maintaining its dominant position. Think of it as a carefully orchestrated symphony of low prices, designed to drown out any potential newcomer's melodies. But here's where the asymmetry truly shines. The potential entrant lacks perfect information about the incumbent's cost structure, its true demand curve, and its long-term strategic intentions. Is the low price a genuine reflection of low costs, or is it a temporary, predatory tactic? The entrant must decipher this hidden message, weighing the risk of entering a market where the incumbent is willing to engage in a price war. The clarity of the signal is muddled by the fog of imperfect knowledge. Capacity building operates on a similar principle. The established firm invests heavily in production capacity, even if that capacity is not fully utilized in the short run. This excess capacity serves as a credible threat. It whispers to potential entrants, "We are prepared to flood the market with output, should you dare to enter," driving prices down and making your investment worthless. The policymaker might see this as a wasteful deployment of capital, an inefficient allocation of resources. However, the incumbent views it as a necessary deterrent, a preventative measure against future competition. Visualize it as a reservoir of potential production, held in reserve, ready to unleash its force upon any invading force. Again, the asymmetry is key. The potential entrant does not know the true cost of maintaining this excess capacity. Is it a sustainable strategy for the long term, or will the incumbent eventually be forced to curtail production? Furthermore, the entrant must assess the incumbent's willingness to actually use this capacity. Is the threat credible, or is it merely a bluff? These questions swirl in the entrant's mind, shaping its ultimate decision. The effectiveness of both limit pricing and capacity building, therefore, hinges on the degree of information asymmetry. If the entrant has perfect knowledge of the incumbent's costs and intentions, these strategies become less effective. The bluff is called the charade exposed. Conversely, the greater the uncertainty, the more powerful these deterrents become. The game becomes a tense dance of veiled threats and calculated risks. The strategic barriers we've discussed are not immutable. A clever entrant might find ways to overcome them, perhaps by targeting a niche market, developing a superior product, or forging strategic alliances. But the incumbent, too, can adapt its strategy, refining its tactics and deepening its defenses. The dynamic interplay between incumbent and entrant is a constant evolution, a never-ending quest for competitive advantage. Empirical evidence. Testing the validity of limit pricing. The theoretical frameworks we've constructed, like intricate clockwork mechanisms, are beautiful in their precision. But, As any watchmaker knows, a beautiful design is only as good as its ability to accurately tell time. Our theoretical models of limit pricing, the strategic lowering of prices to deter potential entrants, demand empirical scrutiny. We must examine the evidence, sift through the noise, and attempt to discern whether this strategy truly influences market dynamics in the way our models predict. Empirical testing in economics, particularly when dealing with strategic behavior, is akin to trying to measure the wind. We cannot directly observe the motivations of firms, the fears and aspirations of potential entrants. We can only observe their actions, their prices, their investments, their market shares, and attempt to infer the underlying strategic dance. This is a delicate balancing act, fraught with challenges. One primary challenge lies in isolating the effect of limit pricing from other factors influencing entry. Consider a market with a dominant incumbent and several potential rivals circling like vultures. The incumbent's low prices might indeed be a calculated attempt to deter entry, a credible signal of its willingness to fight. However, those same low prices might also be a reflection of superior efficiency, of lower production costs, that simply allow the incumbent to outcompete all comers. Disentangling these motivations requires careful econometric analysis, a rigorous separation of signal from noise. Early empirical studies often sought to identify instances where firms maintained lower than profit maximizing prices prior to the entry of a competitor. The idea was simple. If a firm deliberately sacrificed short-term profits to forestall future competition, that would be strong evidence in favor of limit pricing. However, the interpretation of these findings remained contentious. The classical economist, ever skeptical, argued that low prices were often a sign of competitive pressures, not necessarily a premeditated act of deterrence. Another line of inquiry focused on the relationship between market structure and entry rates. If limit pricing is effective, we might expect to see lower entry rates in markets dominated by a few large firms, particularly if those firms have a history of aggressive price competition. Some studies have found weak support for this proposition, but the evidence is far from conclusive. Market structure is a complex ecosystem, influenced by a myriad of factors beyond the control of any single firm. A more sophisticated approach involves examining the impact of capacity investments on entry. Building excess capacity, even if it remains idle, can serve as a credible threat to potential entrants. It signals the incumbent's ability to quickly and significantly increase production if challenged, flooding the market and driving prices down. The policymaker might be interested in this, as investment policy may be important. Studies that have looked at the relationship between capacity and entry have yielded more nuanced results. Sometimes excess capacity appears to deter entry, sometimes it does not. The effect seems to depend on the specific industry, the credibility of the incumbent's commitment, and the perceived threat from potential rival. The empirical literature on limit pricing, therefore, paints a mixed picture. While some studies provide suggestive evidence in support of the theory, others find little or no effect. The overall consensus is that limit pricing is a more complex and context-dependent phenomenon than the simple theoretical models suggest. It is not a universal strategy, but rather one that is likely to be employed only under certain conditions. When entry barriers are relatively low, when the incumbent has a strong reputation for aggressive competition, and when the potential entrants are particularly risk-averse. The challenge for future research lies in developing more refined empirical techniques, methods capable of disentangling the intricate web of strategic interactions that characterize real-world markets. We need to move beyond simple correlations and develop models that can capture the dynamic, strategic nature of entry deterrence. The winds of competition are constantly shifting, and we must adapt our instruments to accurately measure their force. Chapter 17. Analyzing real-world cases. Industries with dominant firms. We've journeyed through the theoretical frameworks of limit pricing and capacity expansion as tools wielded by dominant firms to discourage potential competitors. Now, let's descend from the abstract heights and consider how these strategies manifest themselves in various industries. Think of it as transitioning from studying blueprints to examining the finished architecture. Industries characterized by the presence of a dominant firm, a titan holding significant market share, often display these strategic maneuvers with striking clarity. The underlying logic remains consistent: maintain market power by preemptively neutralizing threats to that power. The mechanisms, however, vary depending on the specific industry dynamic. Consider the airline industry. In certain regional markets, a single carrier might possess a substantial advantage: a hub airport, established brand recognition, and a network of routes. Limit pricing, in this context, translates to aggressively matching, or even undercutting, the fares of any new entrant. The message is clear: entry will be met with a price war, squeezing margins to the point where the venture becomes unprofitable. This isn't simply about reacting to competition. It's about signaling a relentless commitment to defending market share. Now, capacity expansion in the airline industry takes the form of adding flights to overlapping routes. By increasing the number of available seats, the dominant carrier reduces the potential market share available to the newcomer, further diminishing their incentives to enter. This expansion need not even be fully utilized. The mere threat of increased capacity can be enough to deter entry. The key lies in credibility. The dominant firm must convince potential entrants that these threats are genuine and sustainable. This credibility is often built upon a history of aggressive behavior, a reputation for unwavering defense of market share, and access to resources that smaller firms lack. Let's turn our attention to another sector: the beverage industry. Consider a scenario where a long-established soft drink company faces the potential entry of a new brand. Limit pricing, in this case, might involve aggressive promotional campaigns, discounts, and bundled offerings designed to make it difficult for the newcomer to gain traction. The established brand can leverage its existing distribution networks and brand loyalty to maintain a price point that discourages entry, even if it means sacrificing some short-term profits. Capacity expansion, in this context, manifests as an overwhelming presence on store shelves. Securing prime shelf space, negotiating exclusive deals with retailers, and offering a wide variety of product variations can create a formidable barrier. The newcomer, facing limited access to distribution channels and the challenge of competing against a well-established brand portfolio, may find the entry cost prohibitively high. These strategies are not without risk. Limit pricing can erode profits in the short term, and capacity expansion can lead to excess inventory if demand doesn't materialize as expected. The dominant firm must carefully weigh the costs and benefits of these actions, taking into account the likelihood of entry and the potential impact on its long-term profitability. The situation requires delicate balancing of present and future value, a constant recalibration of strategic weighting. Furthermore, antitrust authorities often scrutinize these practices, particularly if they appear to be aimed at unfairly eliminating competition. The policymaker, tasked with maintaining a level playing field, must carefully assess whether these strategies are simply a reflection of superior efficiency or an attempt to stifle innovation and reduce consumer choice. The line between legitimate competition and anti-competitive behavior can be blurred, demanding careful economic analysis and legal interpretation. The classical economist would argue for careful deregulation, but others disagree. The effectiveness of entry deterrence strategies also depends on the specific characteristics of the market. Factors such as the degree of product differentiation, the level of consumer loyalty, and the regulatory environment can all influence the likelihood of successful entry and the effectiveness of strategies like limit pricing and capacity expansion. Ultimately, the decision to employ these strategies is a strategic calculation, a gamble on future market dynamics. The dominant firm must assess its own capabilities, anticipate the actions of potential competitors, and navigate the complex landscape of regulations and market forces. It's a constant game of chess, with the stakes being market share and long-term profitability. Chapter 18. Antitrust implications of limit pricing and strategic barriers. Last time, we gently probed the nuances of market structure and how inherent advantages can, subtly but powerfully, shape competitive outcomes. Tonight, we delve into the murkier waters of strategic advantages actively created to deter potential entrants. We're entering the domain of entry deterrence, a world where seeming generosity can mask a steely intent, the intent to maintain dominance. Consider, for a moment, a perfectly balanced stream. a gentle current, sufficient for life to flourish, yet not so strong as to erode the banks. Now, imagine someone building a dam, subtly altering the flow, ensuring their section of the river thrives while others wither. This, in essence, is what we're talking about. Strategic barriers. The most classic example, perhaps, is limit pricing. Imagine a firm, already established and enjoying considerable market share, deliberately setting its price below the short-run profit-maximizing level. It sacrifices immediate gains, but for a purpose, to signal to potential entrants that the market is already saturated, that profits are meager, and that entry would be, well, unprofitable. Think of it as a carefully crafted illusion. The classical economist might argue that such behavior is perfectly rational, simply a firm responding to the realities of competition. And, at a superficial level, that's true. However, the critical nuance lies in the intent behind the pricing. Is it a genuine reflection of costs and demand? Or a carefully calculated strategy to manipulate perceptions? Proving this intent, of course, is the challenge for the policymaker. Antitrust law, in its essence, seeks to preserve competition, to ensure a level playing field. But intervening in pricing decisions is a delicate act. Lower prices are generally seen as beneficial to consumers, and to penalize a firm for offering them requires compelling evidence of anti-competitive intent. This is where the concept of credibility becomes paramount. A low price is only effective as a deterrent if potential entrants believe it will be maintained even after they enter. If they suspect the incumbent will simply raise prices once they're in the market, the deterrent crumbles. This is where capacity enters the equation. Having excess capacity, the ability to rapidly increase output, signals a credible commitment to defend market share, even at lower prices. It's the economic equivalent of a large, well-equipped army, a deterrent to invasion. Imagine a firm with significant unused production capacity. It whispers a silent threat. Enter, and I will flood the market, driving prices even lower, ensuring your venture fails. This threat, though unspoken, can be incredibly potent. It transforms the market from a welcoming invitation to a daunting challenge. But what if the threat is empty? What if the firm lacks the financial resources or the logistical capability to actually follow through? This is where antitrust scrutiny becomes crucial. The policymaker must carefully analyze the firm's true capabilities, its past behavior, and the overall market dynamics to determine whether the apparent barrier is genuine or merely a bluff. Strategic barriers extend beyond simply holding excess capacity or employing limit pricing. They can involve investment in research and development to create proprietary technologies, aggressive advertising campaigns to build brand loyalty, or even strategically locating facilities to preempt potential competitors. Each of these actions, while potentially beneficial in their own right, can also serve to raise the stakes for new entrants, making it more difficult and costly for them to compete. The delicate balance, then, lies in distinguishing between legitimate competitive advantages, the fruits of innovation and efficiency, and artificially constructed barriers designed solely to exclude rivals. It's a subtle distinction, often requiring a deep understanding of the industry and the firm's strategic intentions. And it's a question that continues to challenge antitrust authorities around the world. As we drift onward, we'll be considering the role of network effects and the even stickier issue of essential facilities. Are some resources so critical to market access that denying competitors access to them constitutes an abuse of dominance? And how can we ensure that innovation isn't stifled in the process of promoting competition? These questions, they await us. Chapter 19. Predatory Pricing, a controversial form of entry deterrence. Good evening. As we gently float onward from our consideration of network effects, a phenomenon that naturally erects barriers to entry, let us now turn our attention to strategies firms actively employ to discourage competitors. Tonight, we'll delve into the intriguing, and often murky, world of predatory pricing, a controversial tactic used to maintain market dominance. Consider it a storm subtly brewing beneath the calm surface of competition. Predatory pricing, at its heart, is the practice of temporarily lowering prices, often below cost, to drive existing competitors out of the market or prevent new ones from entering. Imagine a dominant firm, a large ship sailing the seas of the market, encountering smaller vessels attempting to join its route. To maintain its exclusive passage, it might deliberately create turbulent waves, making it difficult, if not impossible, for the smaller ships to navigate. Once the competition is subdued, the dominant firm can then raise prices back to or even above their original levels, recouping its losses and enjoying the benefits of a less competitive landscape. The rationale behind this seemingly irrational behavior lies in the long-term strategic advantage it confers. The firm accepts short-term losses to achieve long-term market power. This future monopoly, or at least oligopoly, allows them to extract higher profits that far outweigh the initial sacrifices. It's akin to investing in a long-term bond, accepting a lower initial yield for the security of future returns. However, the true nature of predatory pricing is often difficult to discern. It treads a fine line between legitimate competitive pricing and anti-competitive behavior. Intense price competition is, after all, a normal and often desirable feature of a healthy market. The classical economist would argue that lower prices, even if they temporarily harm some firms, ultimately benefit consumers. The challenge lies in distinguishing between an aggressive competition that drives efficiency and deliberate predatory actions designed to eliminate rivals. One key indicator of predatory pricing is the intent of the firm. Is the firm genuinely trying to offer consumers better value, or is it specifically targeting weaker competitors for elimination? Unfortunately, intent is notoriously difficult to prove. Economic analysis can help, but it rarely provides definitive answers. Economists look for patterns of pricing behavior that suggest a strategic motive beyond simply maximizing profits in the short run. For instance, if prices are lowered only in markets where there are new entrants, and then raised again once those entrants are gone, it raises suspicions of predatory intent. Furthermore, the success of a predatory pricing strategy hinges on several factors. First, the predator must have deep pockets, the financial resources to withstand the losses incurred during the period of low prices. Secondly, the predator must be able to effectively target its pricing strategy. It can't simply lower prices across the board. It must focus on the markets or geographic areas where it faces competition from the targeted firms. Finally, the predator must be able to raise prices after the competition is eliminated. If new entrants are likely to emerge quickly, the predatory strategy may be self-defeating. The policymaker, tasked with protecting consumers and promoting competition, faces a formidable challenge in regulating predatory pricing. Overly aggressive regulation could stifle legitimate price competition, harming consumers in the process. On the other hand, a lack of regulation could allow dominant firms to engage in anti-competitive behavior, leading to higher prices and reduced innovation. Finding the right balance is a delicate art, requiring careful consideration of the specific circumstances of each case. Economists have developed various tests and guidelines to help identify predatory pricing. One common approach is to examine the firm's costs. If prices are below marginal cost, or even average variable cost, it suggests that the firm is not simply trying to maximize profits in the short run, but rather pursuing a strategic objective. However, even this cost-based analysis is not foolproof. Defining and measuring costs can be complex, and firms may have legitimate reasons for selling below cost in certain circumstances, such as during promotional periods, or to clear excess inventory. The debate surrounding predatory pricing highlights the inherent tension between competition and cooperation in the marketplace. While competition is generally beneficial, it can also lead to strategic behavior that harms consumers. The challenge lies in designing policies that promote healthy competition while preventing firms from abusing their market power. As we conclude this exploration, consider this. If predatory pricing is so difficult to prove and so risky to implement, why does it remain such a persistent concern for policymakers and economists alike? Perhaps the mere threat of predatory pricing is enough to deter potential entrants, thereby allowing dominant firms to maintain their market power without ever actually engaging in the practice. This question, and others like it, lead us into the complex world of signaling and asymmetric information, which will be our focus next time. Good night. Legal frameworks governing predatory pricing and anti-competitive conduct. Last time, we explored the overt manifestations of anti-competitive behavior. Now let us turn our attention to the more subtle, strategic maneuvers employed by established firms. Entry deterrence. Imagine a tranquil pond, already populated by a large, well-fed fish. It wants to ensure no smaller fish dare to enter and compete for its resources. This desire is the essence of entry deterrence. The pond's current tranquility is an illusion. Strategic barriers are being built. We must gently probe the depths of limit pricing and excess capacity, understanding how these actions shape the competitive landscape and how legal frameworks attempt to maintain equilibrium. Think of it as a balancing act, where too much power on one side disrupts the entire ecosystem. Limit pricing, in its most basic form, involves an incumbent firm setting a price below its own short-run profit-maximizing level, yet above its average cost. Why would a firm willingly sacrifice short-term profits? The answer lies in the signal this price sends to potential entrants. The classical economist would see this as a rational calculation. The incumbent aims to deter entry by making the market appear less attractive, signaling low profitability, perhaps even suggesting that current costs are already incredibly low. Consider this: a potential entrant considering entering the market might estimate its own costs of production. If the incumbent firm's price is close to those estimated costs, the potential entrant might conclude that the market is simply not profitable enough to warrant the investment and risk of entry. It is a psychological barrier constructed of perceived profitability. The policymaker, however, views limit pricing with suspicion. While seemingly beneficial to consumers in the short term due to lower prices, it can stifle innovation and reduce consumer choice in the long run. The challenge lies in distinguishing legitimate competitive pricing from strategic attempts at entry deterrence. Legal frameworks must carefully tread this line, recognizing that pricing above average cost is typically considered pro-competitive, even if it impacts potential entrants. Now, let's consider the concept of excess capacity. Imagine the incumbent firm has built a factory much larger than it currently needs to serve the existing market demand. This excess capacity acts as a credible threat. If a new firm enters the market, the incumbent can rapidly increase its output, driving prices down and making it difficult for the new entrant to achieve profitability. The excess capacity serves as a loaded weapon, ready to be deployed should the tranquility of the pond be disturbed. Legal frameworks are particularly concerned with strategically building and maintaining excess capacity solely for the purpose of deterring entry. The act of simply having spare capacity isn't inherently illegal, but the intent behind that capacity is crucial. Was it created to genuinely anticipate future demand growth, or was it constructed solely to discourage potential competitors? Proving intent is, as you might imagine, a significant challenge. Furthermore, the scale of the capacity matters. A small amount of excess capacity might be seen as prudent business planning, providing a buffer against unexpected demand surges. However, a massive, disproportionate investment in capacity, far exceeding any realistic projection of future demand, might raise red flags. The economic analysis then pivots towards evaluating the rationality of the investment decision, absent the exclusionary motive. The challenge for the policymaker lies in designing legal frameworks that effectively prevent anti-competitive use of limit pricing and excess capacity without unduly hindering legitimate business strategies. We need to foster an environment where firms are incentivized to compete on merit, not on the ability to strategically deter new entrants. Finding that sweet spot, that equilibrium, remains a complex and ongoing endeavor. As we conclude this chapter, consider this: how do these strategic barriers, once erected, influence the subsequent phases of market competition? Do they reshape the very nature of innovation and efficiency in the long run? A question to ponder as we drift onwards, towards the next bend in our economic river. Understanding switching costs and their impact on market entry. Welcome back, my friends. In our previous discussion, we explored the delicate art of product differentiation, a subtle dance that allows firms to carve out their niche in the market ecosystem. Tonight, our focus shifts to another potent force shaping market dynamics: switching costs. These seemingly small impediments can, in reality, become formidable barriers, influencing not only consumer behavior, but also the very possibility of new firms entering a market. We will explore how understanding switching costs is crucial to appreciating entry deterrence and strategic barriers like limit pricing and capacity expansion. Imagine, if you will, a flowing river. The current represents the natural churn of customers, a constant stream of individuals seeking the best value. Switching costs are akin to small dams or weirs placed within that river. They don't completely block the flow, but they certainly impede it, making it more difficult, and perhaps more expensive, for customers to change their chosen path. Switching costs are the expenses, both monetary and psychological, that a consumer incurs when switching from one product or service to another. They are the friction in the system, the resistance to change. These costs can take many forms. There are financial costs, like early termination fees on a cell phone contract or the cost of retraining employees on new software. There are also procedural costs, the sheer hassle of learning a new system, transferring data, or establishing new accounts. And then there are relational costs, the disruption of established relationships with suppliers or service providers. A business might be reluctant to change because of the personal connections it has forged over the years. All of these combine to act as a sticky glue, keeping customers where they are, even if a potentially better alternative exists. The presence of significant switching costs profoundly impacts market entry. A potential entrant, contemplating the leap into an established market, must factor in the hurdle these costs present. The entrant needs to offer a significantly superior product or service, or a dramatically lower price, to overcome the customer's inertia. They must essentially compensate the customer for the inconvenience and cost of switching. This is where the concepts of entry deterrence and strategic barriers come into play. Now, let us consider limit pricing. This strategy is a preemptive tactic employed by incumbent firms to discourage new entrants. Imagine a castle, well defended and stocked with resources. The incumbent, like a shrewd castle lord, sets a price for their product that is low enough to make entry unprofitable for potential rivals, even if the incumbent could, in theory, charge a higher price. The incumbent sacrifices some short-term profit to signal to potential entrants that the market is already saturated and offers little room for new competitors. The classical economist would observe that the low price, while benefiting existing consumers, ultimately reduces overall welfare by stifling competition. Another potent tool in the arsenal of entry deterrence is capacity expansion. An incumbent firm, anticipating potential entry, might strategically invest in expanding its production capacity far beyond its current needs. This signals to potential entrants that the incumbent is prepared to engage in a price war to maintain market share if necessary. The visual analogy here is a very large warehouse filled with product. The policymaker, tasked with maintaining a fair and competitive market, needs to carefully consider whether such expansions are genuinely driven by anticipated market growth or merely intended to intimidate rivals. The beauty and the complexity lies in the interplay of these factors. Switching costs provide the incumbent with a degree of protection, making it harder for entrants to gain a foothold. Limit pricing and capacity expansion are strategic responses designed to amplify this protection and deter potential rivals. They represent the incumbent's strategic dance upon the economic stage. These actions are not always straightforward. If the limit price is too low, the incumbent may forego substantial profits. Excessive capacity expansion carries its own financial risks. These are strategic decisions with potential costs and benefits. This brings us to an important point. Information is key. Accurate market research, insightful analysis of competitor strategies, and a deep understanding of consumer behavior are crucial for navigating this complex terrain. The study of switching costs and entry deterrence is not merely an academic exercise. It has profound implications for businesses, policymakers, and consumers alike. By understanding the forces that shape market dynamics, we can create a more vibrant, innovative, and competitive economic landscape. And so, as we prepare to conclude our discussion for the evening, I leave you with this thought. How do emergent technologies, specifically those that reduce transaction costs and facilitate information flows, disrupt established switching cost dynamics, and alter the balance of power between incumbents and potential market entrants. It is a question worth pondering as we move forward in our exploration of the intricate world of economics. Good night, my friends. May your dreams be filled with efficient markets and balanced equilibria. Chapter 22: Network Effects and the Challenge of Entering Platform Markets. Good evening. Tonight, we delve into the fascinating intersection of network effects, platform economics, and the often daunting challenge of entering these established marketplaces. We'll consider how existing platforms strategically construct barriers to entry, leveraging concepts like limit pricing and capacity management to deter potential competitors. Think of it as navigating a river delta. The currents are strong, the channels are narrow, and the existing infrastructure dictates the course. Let us first revisit the nature of network effects. They create a positive feedback loop. The more users a platform attracts, the more valuable it becomes to each individual user. This inherent advantage translates into a significant incumbency advantage. A newcomer, even with a superior product, faces the arduous task of overcoming this established network. They must offer something substantially better or cheaper to entice users to switch, bearing in mind the inherent costs, both tangible and psychological, associated with abandoning a familiar ecosystem. Now, consider the classical strategies of entry deterrence. One well-worn tactic is limit pricing. The incumbent platform deliberately prices its services below the level that would maximize short-term profits. Why? To signal to potential entrants that profitability in this market is inherently low, discouraging them from entering in the first place. The classical economist might argue this is a rational response to the threat of competition, a preventative measure to safeguard market share. The policymaker, however, must consider whether such pricing constitutes anti-competitive behavior, stifling innovation, and ultimately harming consumers. The challenge for the new entrant is to determine whether the limit pricing is a genuine reflection of low-cost operations or a strategic maneuver. Is the incumbent simply very efficient, or are they deliberately sacrificing profits to maintain their dominance? Discerning this requires careful analysis of the incumbent's cost structure, market dynamics, and any publicly available information. The potential entrant must weigh the risk of entering a market with artificially suppressed prices against the possibility of undercutting the incumbent's true costs and gaining a foothold. Another potent tool in the incumbent's arsenal is capacity management. This refers to strategically investing in productive capacity far exceeding current demand. The message sent is clear. Any new entrant will face a price war should they attempt to gain significant market share. The incumbent can credibly threaten to increase output, driving prices down and making it unprofitable for the new entrant to operate. This is akin to building a dam not to generate electricity, but to control the flow of water and prevent others from tapping into the source. It's a visible, credible deterrent. Capacity needn't be just physical. Consider the digital realm. A platform might invest heavily in server infrastructure, far beyond its immediate needs, signaling its ability to handle a massive influx of users should a competitor emerge. Or it might preemptively acquire key technological components or strategic partnerships, essentially cornering the market on critical resources. These actions increase the sunk costs for any potential entrant, making the decision to compete far more risky. Furthermore, the effectiveness of these deterrent strategies depends heavily on the credibility of the incumbent's threats. Does the incumbent actually have the resources and the willingness to engage in a price war or a capacity battle? The answer often lies in the incumbent's reputation, its past behavior, and the observable commitment it has made to defending its market position. An incumbent with a history of aggressive tactics is far more likely to deter entry than one perceived as passive or risk-averse. However, these strategies are not without their limitations. Limit pricing, for instance, reduces the incumbent's current profits. Excess capacity ties up capital that could be used for other investments. And both strategies can backfire if the potential entrant possesses a truly disruptive innovation that renders the incumbent's existing advantages obsolete. Ultimately, the decision to enter a platform market against a dominant incumbent is a complex one, requiring careful consideration of network effects, strategic barriers, and the incumbent's likely response. It's a delicate balancing act between ambition and pragmatism. The potential entrant must carefully assess the risks and rewards, develop a robust business plan, and perhaps most importantly, possess the courage to challenge the status quo. Patents and intellectual property as barriers to entry. Last time, we considered the subtle dance of network effects, observing how installed bases and standards wars can shape markets, favoring incumbents and discouraging new ventures. Now, we turn our attention to a more formalized, legally enshrined form of entry deterrence: patents and intellectual property. These constructs, intended to spur innovation, can paradoxically become significant barriers to entry, altering the competitive landscape in profound ways. Consider the delicate balance at play. On one side, we have the incentive to innovate. Granting temporary monopolies via patents offers the prospect of substantial returns on investment, encouraging firms to undertake costly research and development. Without this protection, the fruits of their labor could be quickly copied, eroding profits and stifling future innovation. The policymaker strives to cultivate this incentive, nurturing the seeds of progress. On the other side, we have the potential for abuse. Patents, particularly when broadly defined or aggressively enforced, can create formidable hurdles for new entrants. A company holding a key patent, even if not actively exploiting it, can prevent others from developing competing products or technology. This strategic use of intellectual property can effectively lock in market dominance, even if the original innovation has long been surpassed by better alternatives. The classical economist cautions against such rigid structures, believing in the power of open competition. This leads us to explore entry deterrence and strategic barriers, specifically limit pricing and capacity within the context of intellectual property. Let's begin with limit pricing. Imagine a market where a single firm holds a patent on a crucial component. This firm could choose to maximize profits immediately, charging a high price that reflects its monopolistic position. However, such a strategy might attract potential competitors who are willing to invest in developing workarounds or alternative technologies, even if it requires significant time and resources. To preempt this, the incumbent firm might adopt a limit pricing strategy. This involves setting a price lower than the short-run profit-maximizing level, making entry appear less attractive to potential rivals. The lower price reduces the potential profit margin for entrants, increasing the perceived risk and decreasing the likelihood of competition. Now, consider the role of capacity. A firm possessing a substantial intellectual property portfolio, particularly patents that are not fully utilized, can create a credible threat of increased production. This excess capacity, though represented in legal form rather than physical assets, signals to potential entrants that the incumbent can quickly ramp up output and drive down prices if challenged. The threat of such a response, even if never actually carried out, can be enough to deter entry. This is because the entrant must factor in the possibility of a price war, which could render their investment unprofitable. Furthermore, the sheer complexity of patent thickets, overlapping sets of intellectual property rights held by multiple parties, can act as a deterrent. Navigating this legal maze requires significant expertise and resources, disproportionately burdening smaller firms and startups. The cost of litigation, even in the absence of a successful challenge, can be prohibitive. This creates a chilling effect, discouraging innovation in areas where patent rights are densely clustered. These strategies often combine. A firm with a dominant patent portfolio might aggressively pursue infringers, signaling its willingness to defend its intellectual property at all costs. This can create a climate of uncertainty and fear, discouraging investment in related technology. Simultaneously, they might engage in cross-licensing agreements with other large firms, further entrenching their market position and excluding smaller players. The market becomes less a free-flowing river and more of a managed reservoir, held back by dams of legal precedent and strategic alliances. The impact of patents and intellectual property on competition is thus a complex and multifaceted issue. While intended to foster innovation, These protections can also be used strategically to erect barriers to entry, limit competition, and entrench market power. This prompts us to consider the regulatory frameworks that govern intellectual property rights. Do these frameworks adequately balance the competing interests of innovation incentives and competitive markets? And if not, what reforms might be necessary to ensure a more dynamic and equitable economic landscape? This investigation, of course, will be our guiding star in the chapters to come. For now, let these thoughts gently simmer in the quiet spaces of the mind. Regulatory barriers to entry, licensing and permitting. Good evening. As we gently transition from the intricate dance of product differentiation and advertising, a dance that sought to subtly shape consumer preferences, we now find ourselves at another crucial gateway determining the competitive landscape, the realm of regulatory barriers to entry. Tonight, we'll consider how licensing and permitting, often framed as tools for ensuring quality and safety, can inadvertently, or perhaps quite intentionally, become formidable entry deterrents. Imagine a tranquil pond. A new species attempting to enter this ecosystem faces inherent challenges: finding food, avoiding predators, adapting to the existing environmental condition. Similarly, in a marketplace, new firms face these natural barriers, developing efficient production processes, attracting customers, and establishing brand recognition. But what happens when artificial dams are erected, hindering the natural flow? That's where regulatory barriers come in. Licensing, in its essence, aims to protect consumers. It seeks to ensure that professionals providing specialized services, doctors, lawyers, plumbers, possess the requisite knowledge and skills. The policymaker, in enacting such regulations, intends to safeguard the public interest. However, the path to regulation is rarely straight, and unintended consequences often lurk around the bend. Stringent licensing requirements can significantly increase the cost of entry into a market. Examinations can be difficult, experience requirements extensive, and application processes convoluted. All these factors, while potentially weeding out unqualified individuals, also deter potentially competent entrants, especially those with limited resources. Permitting follows a similar trajectory. Consider the establishment of a new manufacturing plant. Environmental regulations, zoning laws, and building codes all necessitate permits. Again, the policymaker's intentions are generally laudable: to protect the environment, ensure public safety, and maintain orderly urban development. Yet, the complexity and duration of the permitting process can be considerable. Delays in obtaining permits translate directly into increased costs for new firms, delaying their entry and potentially discouraging them altogether. This is particularly impactful in industries requiring rapid adaptation to changing market demands. Now, let us turn our attention to the more strategic implications of these barriers. Entry deterrence is a classic game, one where incumbent firms leverage their position to discourage potential competitors. Limit pricing is one such strategy. The incumbent, recognizing the threat of new entrants, deliberately sets prices below the profit-maximizing level. This sacrificed profit serves as a signal to potential entrants: the market is already saturated, margins are thin, and entry will be unprofitable. The lower price acts as a deterrent, making the pond appear less appealing. Capacity expansion is another powerful tool. An incumbent firm can strategically invest in excess production capacity. This excess capacity serves as a credible threat. If a new firm enters, the incumbent can unleash this capacity, flooding the market and driving prices down. The potential entrant, facing the prospect of a price war, may reconsider its decision. This strategy is effective because it demonstrates a commitment to defend market share, even at the expense of short-term profits. Regulatory capture further complicates the matter. It occurs when incumbent firms, through lobbying and political influence, shape regulations to their advantage. They might argue for stricter licensing requirements, ostensibly to protect consumers, but in reality, to protect their market share. They might advocate for environmental regulations that impose disproportionately high costs on new entrants. This subtle manipulation of the regulatory landscape can effectively create an uneven playing field, solidifying the dominance of established players. So, as the shadows lengthen, consider the delicate balance inherent in regulatory policy. The policymaker aims to protect the public interest, but regulations can inadvertently create barriers to entry, stifling competition and hindering innovation. The classical economist understands that free entry and exit are essential for a healthy and dynamic economy, but acknowledges the need for some regulations to address market failures. The challenge lies in finding the optimal balance, in crafting regulations that are effective in achieving their intended goals without unduly restricting competition. As we prepare to drift off, ponder this. How can we design regulatory frameworks that promote both consumer protection and market dynamism? What mechanisms can ensure that regulations are not captured by special interests, but rather serve the broader public good? These are questions that will guide our exploration of the next economic phase. Chapter 25. The role of government subsidies and tax incentives. Last time, we explored how firms strategically manipulate their production capacity to deter potential entrants. That dance of commitment, that quiet assertion of dominance. Now, let's consider how governments, with their own agendas, can enter this already complex interplay, wielding the instruments of subsidies and tax incentives. Imagine a river, its natural course carefully shaped and diverted by human hands. Government subsidies are much the same. They are targeted interventions, intended to alter the landscape of profitability, influencing the choices of both incumbent firms and potential entrants. How does this relate to limit pricing, that carefully calibrated dance of low prices designed to ward off competition? Subsidies, in this context, can be powerful tools. A subsidy, in its simplest form, reduces the cost of production for a firm. This allows the incumbent, the firm already established in the market, to lower its prices even further without sacrificing profitability. The limit price, remember, is set below the level that would typically prevail in a competitive market, making entry appear less attractive. A well-placed subsidy amplifies this effect. It provides the incumbent with an additional buffer, a financial cushion to absorb the costs of maintaining a low-price strategy. Consider a scenario where a firm is contemplating entering a market dominated by an incumbent employing limit pricing. The entrant will weigh the expected profits against the initial investment and the perceived risks. Now, imagine the incumbent receives a significant subsidy tied to production volume. Suddenly, the limit price becomes even lower. The entrant's expected profits shrink, and the attractiveness of entry diminishes significantly. The subsidy has, in effect, strengthened the incumbent's ability to deter entry. Tax incentives, on the other hand, function more subtly. They are not direct infusions of cash, but rather reductions in the tax burden, designed to encourage specific behaviors. In the realm of entry deterrence, tax incentives can be strategically woven into the economic fabric to create barriers, though their effect is less immediate. One common approach involves providing tax breaks to firms that invest in capacity expansion. Remember our earlier discussion of the commitment game. A large unused capacity signals a willingness to fiercely defend market share. Tax incentives can make such investments more appealing, more financially feasible for the incumbent. By effectively subsidizing capacity expansion, the government encourages the incumbent to build a stronger deterrent. The message to potential entrants becomes clear: we are prepared to fight. Furthermore, tax incentives can be used to foster research and development. An incumbent firm that continuously innovates and improves its products gains a significant advantage. These advancements, protected by patents and intellectual property, create a barrier to entry. Potential entrants must either replicate the innovation or develop their own, often at considerable cost and risk. Tax incentives for R&D can accelerate this process, solidifying the incumbent's position and making entry even more challenging. However, it's crucial to remember that these interventions are not without consequences. The policymaker must tread carefully, balancing the desire to protect domestic industries with the potential for distorting competition and harming consumer welfare. Subsidies and tax incentives, while potentially effective in deterring entry, can also create inefficiency. They can shield less efficient firms from competition, leading to higher prices and lower quality products for consumers. The classical economist will surely frown upon this. Moreover, Such policies can trigger retaliatory measures from other countries. Subsidies and tax incentives that unfairly advantage domestic firms can be seen as protectionist measures, prompting trade disputes and even tariffs. The global economic system is a delicate ecosystem, and interventions in one area can have far-reaching and often unintended consequences. The role of government, therefore, is not merely to meddle but to carefully orchestrate. These tools, subsidies and tax incentives, require a deep understanding of the market dynamics, the potential for unintended consequences, and the overall welfare implications. It's a complex calculus, a constant weighing of benefits and costs. As we drift toward the close of this discussion, consider this. How do these government interventions interact with other forms of strategic behavior by firms, such as product differentiation and advertising? Do they amplify or mitigate the effects of these strategies? And what new considerations arise in dynamic markets characterized by rapid technological change? We will explore that question in our next session. Chapter 26: Behavioral Economics and Entry Decisions. Cognitive biases. Last time, we explored the elegant dance of potential competitors, the subtle signals sent, and the actions taken to either welcome or deter new entrants into a market. Now, let's delve into something even more fascinating: the imperfect lens through which these decisions are made. We're moving from the theoretical chessboard of rational actors to the messier, more human landscape of behavioral economics, specifically, the cognitive biases that cloud entry decisions. Consider this chapter as a gentle stream, carrying us from the clear waters of perfect rationality into the slightly muddier, but perhaps more fertile, delta of human psychology. The classical economic model paints a picture of potential entrants carefully weighing costs and benefits, meticulously calculating the probability of success, and rationally deciding whether to brave the market. They factor in the incumbent firm's capacity, production costs, and the possibility of limit pricing, a deliberate strategy by the incumbent to set a price low enough to discourage entry. This model assumes, of course, that everyone involved acts with complete and unbiased information. However, human beings are not calculating machines. We are prone to systematic errors in judgment, cognitive biases that can significantly distort our perception of risk and reward. These biases can drastically alter the entry calculus, leading to decisions that deviate from what a perfectly rational actor might choose. One significant bias in this context is overconfidence. Entrepreneurs, by their very nature, tend to be optimistic. They often believe they possess skills and knowledge superior to their competitors, leading them to overestimate their chances of success. This overconfidence can blind them to potential pitfalls and cause them to underestimate the strength of the incumbent firm's strategic barriers. Think of it as a ship captain, so confident in their navigation skills that they ignore storm warnings, believing they can weather any challenge. Conversely, loss aversion can act as a deterrent. The pain of losing a sum of money is often felt more acutely than the pleasure of gaining the same amount. A potential entrant, keenly aware of the substantial investment required to enter a market, might be overly cautious, magnifying the potential for failure, and thereby choosing to stay out, even if the expected value of entry is positive. This is the careful gardener, who refrains from planting potentially fruitful seeds, fearing a disappointing harvest. Then there's the availability heuristic. Decision makers often rely on easily accessible information to make judgments. Recent failures of similar ventures, even if they are not directly relevant to the current opportunity, can loom large in the mind, discouraging entry. A news report about a startup failing miserably can disproportionately influence perception, regardless of the underlying market dynamics. The incumbent firm, aware of these biases, can strategically exploit them. For instance, aggressive advertising campaigns, while seemingly innocuous, can create a perception of overwhelming market dominance, triggering the availability heuristic and scaring off potential entrants. Similarly, even if limit pricing is not strictly necessary, the incumbent might engage in brief price wars to signal a willingness to defend its market share at all costs, appealing to the potential entrant's loss aversion. Consider also the impact of framing effects. The way information is presented can dramatically alter decisions. Describing a market as having a 90% success rate will likely attract more entrants than describing the same market as having a 10% failure rate, even though the underlying reality is identical. The policymaker needs to be aware that strategic communications during the entry and deterrence game need to be clearly understood by all parties. So, how does behavioral economics reshape our understanding of entry deterrence and strategic barriers, such as limit pricing and capacity expansion? It suggests that these barriers are not merely objective economic realities but also subjective perceptions. A limit price, perceived as a signal of unwavering resolve, can be far more effective than a simple cost-benefit analysis would suggest. Excess capacity, similarly, can serve as a psychological deterrent, intimidating potential entrants who overestimate the incumbent's willingness to engage in a destructive price war. This interplay between objective economic forces and subjective psychological biases adds layers of complexity to entry decisions. It reminds us that markets are not populated by rational automatons, but by individuals with their own unique hopes, fears, and cognitive quirks. Understanding these biases is crucial for both potential entrants seeking to make sound decisions and for incumbent firms seeking to defend their market position. It's a delicate balancing act, a constant adjustment between rational strategy and the unpredictable currents of human behavior. But where do we go from here? How might governments and regulatory bodies use this understanding of cognitive biases to promote fairer and more competitive markets? Are there nudges or interventions that can counteract these biases, encouraging more informed and rational entry decisions? This question of policy and its impact on market dynamism will be our next exploration. Chapter 27. Incumbent Inertia. When dominant firms fail to adapt. Good evening. We've spent some time considering the establishment of monopolies, the forces that concentrate power. Tonight, we turn our attention to their potential downfall. We will explore the curious phenomenon of how dominant firms, once seemingly invincible, can succumb to inertia and fail to adapt, paving the way for new entrants. This often stems from an underestimation of entry deterrence, a critical concept we must examine. Entry deterrence is precisely what it sounds like: strategies employed by incumbent firms to discourage potential competitors from entering the market. Think of it as a castle moat, built to keep invaders at bay. But moats can be breached, and sometimes, the very act of building a robust defense can weaken the castle from within. Tonight, we will examine two key strategies of entry deterrence: limit pricing and excess capacity. Let's begin with limit pricing. Imagine a market where a single firm, a dominant player, controls the vast majority of the sales. To deter new entrants, this firm might choose to set its price below the short-run profit-maximizing level, accepting lower current profits in exchange for preventing future competition. This is limit pricing. The idea is simple. By signaling that the market is not as lucrative as it might appear, the incumbent hopes to dissuade potential entrants. A prospective newcomer, observing the existing low prices, might conclude that entering the market would be unprofitable, not worth the investment and risk. However, the efficacy of limit pricing hinges on several factors. First, it relies on the credibility of the incumbent's commitment. New entrants must believe that the incumbent will maintain the low price even after they enter. If entrants suspect that the incumbent will simply raise prices once they are established, the deterrent effect is greatly diminished. Furthermore, limit pricing can become a self-fulfilling prophecy of stagnation. By accepting lower profits, the incumbent may lack the resources to invest in innovation and adapt to changing consumer preferences, ironically making themselves more vulnerable in the long run. Our second strategic barrier is excess capacity. Imagine a factory operating far below its potential output. This represents a deliberate investment in the ability to quickly increase production should a new competitor emerge. The incumbent, possessing this excess capacity, can credibly threaten to flood the market with goods, driving down prices and making life difficult for any new entrants. Excess capacity acts as a potent signal. It says, "I am ready and willing to defend my market share." The mere threat of deploying this capacity can be enough to keep potential competitors away. However, like limit pricing, excess capacity carries its own risks. Maintaining idle capacity is costly. It ties up capital that could be used for more productive investments. The classical economist might argue this represents an inefficient allocation of resources, a drag on overall economic well-being. Furthermore, the effectiveness of excess capacity as a deterrent depends on the nature of the industry. In rapidly evolving sectors, where technology changes quickly, excess capacity can become obsolete, a stranded asset. The incumbent may find itself saddled with outdated equipment, while new entrants leverage cutting-edge technologies. So, we see a fascinating paradox. The very strategies employed to maintain dominance can inadvertently lead to decline. The desire to protect the status quo can stifle innovation and create vulnerabilities. The policymaker must carefully consider these dynamics when evaluating the anti-competitive effects of mergers and acquisitions. Ultimately, incumbent inertia often stems from a failure to recognize the dynamism of the market. They become so focused on defending their existing position that they miss the opportunities presented by new technologies, changing consumer preferences, and emerging business models. The lesson is clear. Sustained success requires constant adaptation, a willingness to embrace change, and a recognition that no moat is truly impenetrable. But what happens when entry deterrence fails? What are the strategies and tactics employed by disruptors that manage to overcome these barriers? We will explore this next time as the quiet revolution continues. Good night. Chapter 28: Disruptive Innovation. Challenging existing market leaders. We have previously considered the forces that shape market structures. Now, let us turn our attention to how those structures are sometimes dramatically upended. We speak today of disruptive innovation and how established market leaders find their seemingly impregnable positions challenged, not from direct competition, but from the periphery. This disruption is often linked to strategies of entry deterrence, specifically the manipulation of price and productive capacity. Consider the perspective of an incumbent firm, a dominant player in a well-defined market. They've likely spent years cultivating brand loyalty, optimizing production processes, and building a robust distribution network. Their dominance provides substantial profits, but also attracts potential entrants. The incumbent's objective, then, is to deter these new rivals. This is where strategies of limit pricing and capacity investment come into play. Limit pricing is essentially a preemptive price reduction. The dominant firm deliberately lowers its price below the short-run profit-maximizing level. Why would they do this? Because the intent is not to maximize immediate profits, but to signal to potential entrants that the market is already saturated and that opportunities for profitable entry are limited. The classical economist would see this as a rational response to imperfect competition, a firm sacrificing short-term gain for long-term market control. Imagine it as damming a stream, reducing the flow of potential revenue for all who might wish to tap into it. However, limit pricing can be a risky strategy. It involves accepting lower profits in the present, and there is no guarantee that it will successfully deter all entrants. Some firms, perhaps those with particularly innovative technologies or access to cheaper capital, may still choose to enter the market despite the lower price. The gamble inherent in limit pricing makes it a strategy best suited to industries where the barriers to entry are relatively low but not insurmountable. It's a delicate balancing act, a carefully calibrated response designed to discourage rather than crush. Capacity investment, on the other hand, is a more tangible and potentially more effective barrier to entry. The dominant firm invests in significant excess production capacity beyond what is currently needed to meet demand. This sends a powerful message to potential entrants. We are ready and willing to increase output drastically if you try to take market share. This credible threat of increased production can deter entry by suggesting that any new entrant will face fierce price competition and potentially operate at a loss. The policymaker must consider the implications of such strategies. While entry deterrence may benefit the incumbent firm, it can also reduce overall market efficiency and consumer welfare. Less competition can lead to higher prices, lower quality products, and slower rates of innovation. Therefore, antitrust authorities carefully scrutinize capacity expansion and pricing strategies, seeking to ensure that they are not used to stifle competition unfairly. The goal is to foster a market environment where innovation can flourish and consumers benefit from choice and competitive pricing. However, the success of these strategies depends heavily on the credibility of the commitment. Potential entrants must believe that the incumbent firm is genuinely willing and able to follow through on its threats. This credibility can be enhanced by investments that are difficult to reverse, such as building a large, specialized manufacturing plant. These are sunk costs, irreversible commitments that signal a firm's long-term dedication to defending its market share. It is like planting deep roots, anchoring the firm in place and signaling its unwillingness to be displaced. Disruptive innovation often circumvents these barriers, not by directly challenging the incumbent on their own terms, but by introducing a new product or service that caters to a different market segment or utilizes a fundamentally different business model. Think of the rise of digital photography, which initially targeted amateur photographers, but eventually displaced traditional film photography almost entirely. These disruptive forces bypass the carefully constructed defenses of the market leaders, eroding their market share from unexpected angles. The seemingly unassailable fortress is breached, not by a frontal assault, but by a subtle undermining of its foundations. The effectiveness of entry deterrence strategies is constantly being challenged by the dynamism of the marketplace. Incumbent firms must continually adapt and innovate to maintain their competitive advantage. The forces of creative destruction are always at work, reshaping industries and redefining the rules of the game. Class, debt, But how do these disruptions cascade across interconnected markets? What happens when a new technology in one sector fundamentally alters the competitive landscape in another, seemingly unrelated, industry? This inter-industry influence will be our focus next. Chapter 29. The Impact of Globalization on Entry and Competition. We've traced the flows of trade and capital, witnessed the rise and fall of comparative advantage. Now, let us turn our gaze to the arena where these global forces truly play out. The landscape of competition. Globalization, with its increased interconnectedness, fundamentally alters the conditions under which firms compete, particularly concerning the crucial concept of market entry. The ease or difficulty with which new players can enter a market, and the strategies incumbents employ to deter such entry, form a critical nexus in the global economic system. One of the most fascinating aspects of competitive strategy is the art of entry deterrence. Established firms, those already enjoying a position within a market, often seek to maintain their dominance by erecting barriers that discourage potential rivals. These barriers can be structural, inherent to the market itself, or strategic, deliberately constructed by the incumbent firms. Today, we'll focus on the latter, specifically the tactics of limit pricing and capacity expansion. Limit pricing, at its core, is a signaling game. The incumbent firm sets a price lower than the short-run profit-maximizing level. It sacrifices immediate profits to send a message: this market is not as lucrative as you might think. Entry will be costly, perhaps even unsustainable. The classical economist might argue that this behavior is inefficient, distorting the market and preventing the optimal allocation of resources. Yet, from the incumbent's perspective, it's a rational calculation designed to protect long-term profits by discouraging competition. The effectiveness of limit pricing, however, hinges on several factors. The potential entrant must believe the incumbent's signal. If the entrant suspects that the lower price is only temporary, a preemptive strike designed to scare them off, then the strategy will fail. Furthermore, the incumbent must credibly commit to maintaining the lower price even after entry occurs. This commitment is often achieved through reputational effects, a history of acting in accordance with the limit price signal. Consider a scenario where a pharmaceutical company holds a patent on a widely used drug. As the patent nears expiration, generic drug manufacturers begin the circle, poised to enter the market with cheaper alternatives. The incumbent might respond by lowering the price of its branded drug significantly, even below its average cost. This limit pricing strategy signals to the generic manufacturers that the post-patent market will be fiercely competitive, discouraging them from investing heavily in production and distribution. The second strategic barrier, capacity expansion, operates on a different principle. Here, the incumbent firm invests in excess productive capacity, signaling its ability to significantly increase output should new firms enter the market. This threat of oversupply can deter entry by reducing the expected profitability of potential rivals. The sheer volume of goods the incumbent could unleash, should competition arise, serves as a warning. Think of a large steel producer building a massive new plant, even if the current demand doesn't justify it. The excess capacity hangs like a sword of Damocles over any potential entrants. The policymaker would likely scrutinize such behavior for antitrust violations, as it could be construed as an attempt to monopolize the market. However, demonstrating anti-competitive intent can be a complex legal and economic challenge. Capacity expansion, like limit pricing, requires a credible commitment. The incumbent must convince potential entrants that it will actually use its excess capacity to aggressively compete, if necessary. This might involve locking in long-term supply contracts or investing in marketing campaigns designed to capture a large share of the market before entry even occurs. Globalization complicates these strategies. Increased competition from overseas firms can make entry deterrence more difficult. A domestic incumbent might successfully deter local rivals, only to find itself facing competition from a foreign firm, with even lower costs or greater capacity. The global arena requires a more nuanced understanding of competitive dynamics. The interplay of these strategic barriers, limit pricing and capacity expansion, are a delicate dance on the global stage. Success often depends on understanding the psychology of potential entrants, the credibility of the incumbent's commitments, and the ever-shifting landscape of global competition. As we move forward, we must consider how these strategies evolve in the face of disruptive technologies and rapidly changing consumer preferences. Do traditional barriers to entry become obsolete in the digital age, replaced by new forms of strategic manipulation? That is a question for our next exploration. Entry into emerging markets. Unique challenges and opportunities. Having navigated the complex tapestry of market selection, we now find ourselves poised at the threshold of emerging economies. Vibrant ecosystems teeming with both unprecedented opportunity and unforeseen peril. These markets, characterized by rapid growth and evolving consumer landscapes, present a unique playing field where traditional strategies may falter. One of the most significant hurdles, and indeed, a strategic advantage for incumbents, lies in the realm of entry deterrence and strategic barriers. Tonight, we consider limit pricing and capacity as key components. Entry deterrence, at its core, is the practice of established firms actively discouraging potential competitors from entering a market. Think of it as erecting a carefully constructed dam, controlling the flow of new entrants into a previously established economic river. This is not necessarily an anti-competitive activity, though it can become so under certain conditions. It is rather a strategic response to the ever-present threat of competition. The simplest, yet perhaps crudest, tool in this arsenal is limit pricing. Limit pricing involves setting a price below the level that would maximize short-term profits, but above the firm's cost. The intention? To signal to potential entrants that the market is less profitable than it appears. The incumbent sacrifices some immediate gains to maintain long-term market share. It's a gamble, of course. A gamble that the perceived profitability, after limit pricing, won't attract new players nonetheless. The classical economist might argue that perfect information would render limit pricing ineffective. If potential entrants knew the incumbent's true costs and strategic intentions, they could simply factor the limit price into their own calculations. However, in the murky waters of emerging markets, information is rarely perfect. Uncertainty reigns, and limit pricing can be a powerful deterrent, sowing seeds of doubt in the minds of would-be competitors. Beyond pricing strategies, capacity becomes a critical strategic tool. The capacity to produce, to deliver, to service. This represents a very real barrier to entry. Consider a situation where an established firm has invested heavily in expanding its production capacity. This serves not only to meet existing demand, but also to signal to potential entrants that there is little room for them. This excess capacity acts as a credible threat. If a new firm enters, the incumbent can simply flood the market with its existing production, driving down prices and making life very difficult for the newcomer. This is a subtle dance, of course. Too much excess capacity ties up capital, reducing profitability. Too little, and the incumbent risks losing market share to a new, nimbler competitor. In emerging markets, the interplay between limit pricing and capacity is particularly complex. These markets are often characterized by imperfect infrastructure, nascent regulatory frameworks, and volatile consumer behavior. The policymaker often struggles to determine the correct level of intervention, balancing the need to protect consumers with the desire to foster innovation and growth. An incumbent, deeply embedded within the local ecosystem, may possess intimate knowledge of these challenges, knowledge that is unavailable to potential entrants. This asymmetry of information further strengthens the incumbent's ability to deter entry through strategic pricing and capacity decisions. It's crucial to remember that these strategies are not without risk. Aggressive limit pricing can strain profitability, while excessive capacity represents a significant financial burden. The key lies in understanding the specific dynamics of each emerging market, in assessing the potential threat of entry, and in calibrating a strategic response that is both effective and sustainable. The goal is not to stifle competition entirely, but rather to create a defensible market position that allows the firm to thrive in the long term. Think of it as shaping the flow of a river, guiding it towards a productive and sustainable course, rather than simply attempting to block its progress. And there are ethical considerations as well. Is it right to proactively block entry in developing countries that could really benefit from increased competition? As we conclude this exploration of entry deterrence in emerging markets, it is apparent how critical these strategies are in shaping the competitive landscape. But what happens when these barriers crumble? What strategies are available to the nimble entrant, determined to disrupt the established order? That, my friends, is a question for another night, another economic journey. Chapter 31: The Rise of Digital Markets and the Changing Nature of Entry. Welcome back. Last time, we considered the dance of supply and demand, the intricate choreography of prices and quantities. Tonight, we turn our gaze to a different, but related, aspect of market dynamics: the strategies firms employ to protect their established positions, particularly in the face of potential newcomers. We'll be discussing entry deterrence, those strategic barriers carefully constructed to discourage new competitors, and how the rise of digital markets has both amplified and altered these strategies. The question before us is simple: how do incumbents maintain their dominance? One classical method, often cited, is limit pricing. Imagine a market where a single firm, or perhaps a small group of dominant firms, sets a price lower than its own short-run, profit-maximizing level. Why would they do this? The answer lies in their foresight. By setting a lower price, they signal to potential entrants that the market is already saturated, that there isn't enough profit to go around for another player. It's a subtle message, whispered through the language of prices. Enter at your own risk. This market is not as lucrative as it seems. Of course, limit pricing only works under certain conditions. The incumbent must credibly demonstrate that it can maintain the low price, even if a new firm enters. This credibility often hinges on capacity. Consider a manufacturer with a massive, underutilized factory. This excess capacity serves as a potent threat. The potential entrant knows that, should they dare to enter the market, the incumbent can easily ramp up production, flooding the market and driving prices even lower. The capacity acts as a sword hanging over the heads of any aspiring competitors. Think of it as a carefully calibrated ecosystem. The established firm, the apex predator, maintains its position not just through raw power, but through a calculated display of resources. The threat of force sometimes is more effective than force itself. Now, the rise of digital markets has added new layers of complexity to this dance. Traditional barriers, like massive capital investments in physical infrastructure, are often less relevant in the digital realm. A software startup, for example, might require relatively little initial capital compared to, say, a steel mill. This lower barrier to entry would, at first glance, suggest a more competitive landscape. However, digital markets have also given rise to new forms of strategic barriers. Consider network effects. A social media platform, for instance, becomes more valuable as more people use it. This creates a powerful incumbency advantage. Even if a new platform offers superior features, users may be reluctant to switch because they would be leaving their existing network behind. The established platform, by virtue of its size, becomes increasingly difficult to dislodge. It is like a river that has carved its own path over centuries. Diverting its flow becomes a monumental task. Data, too, plays a crucial role. The incumbent firm often has access to vast quantities of user data, which it can use to personalize its products and services, target its marketing efforts, and anticipate market trends. This data advantage creates a significant barrier to entry for newcomers who lack the same informational advantage. It's a self-reinforcing cycle. More users generate more data, which leads to better products and services, which attracts more users. The system balances and maintains its position. The classical tools of entry deterrence, therefore, have been supplemented, and sometimes superseded, by these new digital strategies. Instead of simply building larger factories, firms now focus on building larger networks, accumulating more data, and creating stronger feedback loops. The strategic landscape has shifted, demanding new approaches to regulation and competition policy. The policymaker must now navigate a far more complex terrain. The challenge, of course, is to foster innovation and competition without stifling the very forces that drive progress in the digital economy. How can we ensure that dominant firms don't use their incumbency advantage to stifle innovation and prevent new entrants from challenging their dominance? This is a question we will begin to unravel in our next session. Until then, allow these ideas to settle, to find their place within the larger architecture of your understanding. Chapter 33. The role of venture capital and angel investors in supporting entry. We've explored the dance of firms already established, the ways they maintain their position, the subtle and not so subtle barriers they erect. Now, let's shift our perspective. Let's consider the challenger, the aspiring entrant seeking to disrupt the established order. We will examine the crucial role venture capital and angel investors play in assisting these brave, and often financially vulnerable, newcomers in overcoming entry deterrence. Entry deterrence, as we've discussed, manifests in many forms. Limit pricing, where incumbent firms intentionally set prices low to discourage new competition, is one such tactic. Capacity expansion, another, involves incumbents building excess production capability, signaling a willingness to flood the market and crush any nascent rival. These are strategic barriers, carefully constructed defenses designed to maintain market share and profitability. Imagine a small stream trying to join a mighty river. The river, representing the established market and dominant firms, can redirect the flow, flood the banks, or create obstacles to impede the stream's progress. Venture capital and angel investors, in this metaphor, are akin to engineers, constructing channels, building dams, and providing the necessary impetus for the stream to merge successfully, even flourish, alongside the larger river. These investors provide more than just financial resources. They offer expertise, networks, and credibility, all vital weapons in the arsenal of a fledgling firm facing well-resourced incumbents. Think of the mentorship a seasoned angel investor provides, the introductions to key suppliers and distributors, the guidance in navigating the regulatory landscape. These are invaluable assets that can significantly improve the odds of success. Consider, for example, a startup developing a novel technology that challenges an existing market dominated by a few large players. Without sufficient capital, the startup might be unable to scale its operations, build its brand, or withstand a price war initiated by the incumbents employing limit pricing strategies. Venture capital provides the necessary fuel to navigate these turbulent waters. Furthermore, the very presence of venture capital and angel investors signals to the market that the entrant is a serious contender. It's a stamp of approval, a validation of the startup's business model and potential. This can attract customers, partners, and even talented employees, further strengthening the entrant's position. However, the relationship is not without its complexities. Venture capital and angel investment often come with strings attached. Investors typically demand equity in the company, diluting the founder's ownership. They may also exert influence over strategic decisions, potentially leading to conflicts of interest. The entrant must carefully weigh the benefits of external funding against the potential loss of control. This careful balancing act is the essence of entrepreneurship. The classical economist might argue that intervention by venture capitalists distorts the natural market forces, potentially leading to inefficient allocation of capital. They might contend that only the most viable ventures should survive, regardless of access to external funding. However, the policymaker might counter that venture capital plays a crucial role in fostering innovation and promoting competition, particularly in markets where established firms have erected significant barriers to entry. They might argue that supporting these investors through tax incentives or other policies can lead to long-term economic growth and societal benefits. Ultimately, the effectiveness of venture capital and angel investment in overcoming entry deterrence depends on a multitude of factors, including the quality of the entrant's business model, the strength of the incumbent's defenses, and the overall market environment. It is a complex interplay of risk, reward, and strategic maneuvering. As we consider the interplay of these forces, a key question lingers. Beyond the initial entry, how do these nascent firms then sustain their competitive advantage against incumbents that now recognize the threat and will undoubtedly adapt? What are the strategies for long-term survival in a world where the barriers to entry are constantly evolving? Chapter 34: Crowdfunding and Alternative Sources of Funding for Startups, Entry Deterrence and Strategic Barriers, Limit Pricing and Capacity. Good evening. Tonight, we delve into the intricate world of entry deterrence, specifically focusing on how established firms utilize limit pricing and capacity building to discourage potential competitors from entering their market. Think of it as a sophisticated game of chess, where each move is carefully calculated to maintain dominance and stability. It's a fascinating area, revealing much about the dynamic balance of power within industries. Entry into a market, you see, is not merely a matter of raising capital and launching a product. It's a strategic decision, heavily influenced by the anticipated response of incumbent firms. The classical economist, a pioneer in this field, posited that an established firm can strategically manipulate market conditions to make entry less attractive, even unprofitable, for potential rivals. This is where limit pricing comes into play. Limit pricing involves setting a price below the short-run profit-maximizing level, but high enough to still generate a reasonable return. The intention is not necessarily to maximize immediate profits, but rather to signal to potential entrants that the market is already saturated, and that any attempt to compete will likely result in price wars and diminished returns for everyone involved. It's a subtle message delivered through the language of price. Consider a small artisan coffee shop contemplating expansion into a neighborhood already dominated by a large chain. If the chain consistently offers coffee at a price that barely covers costs, effectively a limit price, the artisan shop may reconsider its plans. The prospect of engaging in a prolonged price war with its inherent risks might be enough to deter entry altogether. This, in essence, is the power of limit pricing. It acts as a preemptive strike, discouraging competition before it even begins. However, limit pricing is not without its limitations. It requires a degree of commitment and the willingness to forgo short-term profits for long-term market share. Furthermore, its effectiveness hinges on the credibility of the threat. Potential entrants must believe that the incumbent firm is genuinely prepared to engage in a price war if necessary. If they perceive the limit price as a bluff, they may proceed with their entry plans regardless. Now let's shift our attention to another powerful tool in the arsenal of entry deterrence: capacity building. An established firm can strategically increase its production capacity, even beyond current demand, to signal its ability to aggressively respond to any new competition. This is akin to a nation bolstering its military strength to deter potential adversaries. Imagine a software company investing heavily in cloud infrastructure, far exceeding its current user base. This excess capacity sends a clear message to aspiring startups. We have the resources and the infrastructure to scale up quickly and absorb any market share you might gain. The startup, facing the daunting prospect of competing with such a well-equipped incumbent, might decide to pursue a different market altogether. The policymaker often grapples with the ethical implications of these strategies. While entry deterrence can protect established firms from competition, it can also stifle innovation and limit consumer choice. The challenge lies in striking a balance between fostering a dynamic, competitive market and allowing firms to reap the rewards of their past investments and market expertise. Strategic barriers to entry, like limit pricing and capacity building, are not always insurmountable. A determined and innovative startup with a truly differentiated product or service can often overcome these obstacles. But understanding these strategies is crucial for anyone considering entering an established market. It allows them to anticipate the potential challenges and develop strategies to navigate them effectively. The ebb and flow of markets, much like the tides, reveals constant shifts in power, strategy, and potential. These are systems of constant balance, where entry deterrence strategies like limit pricing and capacity are weights, constantly being adjusted. But where does innovation fit within this balance? Will the next great market disruption arise in spite of, or because of these well-established strategies? That, my friends, is a question for another evening. Good night. Chapter 35. Analyzing the impact of mergers and acquisitions on entry deterrence. Last time, we explored the intricate dance of firms already present within a market, their strategies a delicate choreography of competition. Tonight, we turn our attention to the shadowy figures lurking just outside that dance floor, potential entrants. We ask ourselves, how do the actions of established players, particularly mergers and acquisitions, affect the likelihood of these entrants joining the fray? Specifically, we'll examine how mergers and acquisitions impact entry deterrence strategies, particularly limit pricing and capacity expansion. Entry deterrence, you see, is a fascinating strategic game. It's about established firms creating an environment where it is simply unprofitable, or at least highly unattractive, for new competitors to enter the market. This can be achieved through a variety of mechanisms, but we will focus on two: limit pricing and strategic capacity. Let's first consider limit pricing. Imagine a tranquil lake. The incumbent firm, a solitary swan, controls the entire expanse. Limit pricing is akin to setting the water level just low enough that other smaller birds, potential entrants, find it too shallow to comfortably navigate. In economic terms, the established firm sets its price below the level that would maximize its short-term profits, intentionally sacrificing some gains to make the market less appealing to newcomers. The idea is that a potential entrant, observing this low price, will conclude that the market is already saturated and that they cannot possibly hope to compete profitably. Now, mergers and acquisitions significantly alter this landscape. A merger, joining two existing swans into one larger, more powerful entity, can make limit pricing more effective, at least in the short run. The merged entity possesses a larger market share and presumably lower costs due to synergies. This allows them to credibly commit to maintaining the low, deterring price. Potential entrants, seeing this consolidated power, are more likely to be dissuaded. A merger provides a signal, a stronger, louder, and clearer message that the market is not welcoming new participants. However, this isn't always the case. Sometimes, the promise of higher profits associated with a less competitive environment after a merger could incentivize entry, believing that the deterring price will be abandoned sooner or later. Then there is strategic capacity. Think of this as building a dam across the lake. The incumbent firm invests in a large amount of production capacity, far exceeding current demand. This sends a message to potential entrants. If you dare to enter, we will unleash this extra capacity, flooding the market and driving prices down, making your entry unprofitable. Mergers and acquisitions can profoundly influence the credibility of this strategy. A merger might reduce the credibility if the newly formed firm decides to streamline operations and shut down some of the excess capacity previously maintained by the merging entities. An entrant might then perceive an opportunity, believing the incumbent no longer has the capacity to engage in a price war. However, if the merger results in an even larger, more diversified entity with access to greater financial resources, the threat of unleashing excess capacity becomes even more daunting. The potential entrant perceives a greater commitment and the potential for a deeper, more sustained price cut. Moreover, consider the type of merger. A horizontal merger, uniting competitors in the same industry, is more likely to create a firm capable of effectively employing limit pricing and strategic capacity. The newly consolidated entity has greater control over supply and price, making entry deterrence strategies more viable. A vertical merger, linking firms at different stages of the supply chain, might have a less direct impact on entry deterrence, but could still alter the cost structure in ways that affect the attractiveness of entry. The policymaker, witnessing these maneuvers, must carefully consider the potential implications. While mergers and acquisitions can lead to efficiencies and innovation, they can also create barriers to entry, stifling competition, and ultimately harming consumers. It becomes a delicate balancing act, fostering innovation while preventing the erection of insurmountable entry barriers. The classical economist, observing this dance, stresses that the long-term effects are often more complex than initially apparent. A merger might deter one type of entrant, but inadvertently create an opportunity for another, perhaps a firm with a radically different business model or access to a new technology. And so, as our evening draws to a close, we are left with a lingering question. How do dynamic industries, those characterized by rapid technological change and constant innovation, affect the effectiveness of these entry deterrence strategies? Do the traditional models of limit pricing and capacity expansion still hold sway in a world where innovation can render even the most formidable incumbent vulnerable? We shall consider this next time, as we navigate the turbulent waters of disruptive technologies and their impact on market structure. Chapter 36. The evolution of antitrust enforcement. In the digital age, we have navigated the historical currents of antitrust, tracing its origins and early adaptations. Now, as we move into the digital age, we must address a crucial aspect of competitive strategy that profoundly impacts market structure: entry deterrence. Think of it as a carefully constructed dam designed to regulate the flow of potential rivals. The concept of entry deterrence revolves around the actions a dominant firm takes to discourage new competitors from entering a market. These actions are, in essence, strategic barriers, obstacles erected not through superior efficiency or inherent advantage, but through deliberate maneuvering. Our focus tonight will be on two significant instruments in this strategic arsenal: limit pricing and excess capacity. Limit pricing is perhaps the more intuitive. Imagine a seasoned shopkeeper, knowing a new competitor is considering setting up across the street. The shopkeeper could drastically lower prices, even accepting short-term losses, to signal to the potential entrant that profitability in this market is elusive. This artificially low price, the limit price, acts as a disincentive, making the market appear less attractive than it truly is. The potential entrant, seeing this, may decide to invest elsewhere. This strategy hinges on assumptions about the entrant's perception of costs and demand. The incumbent firm hopes the entrant believes that the low prices will persist, effectively denying them a profitable foothold. The effectiveness of limit pricing relies heavily on the credibility of the incumbent's commitment. The classical economist might argue that rational actors, possessing perfect information, would see through this charade. However, in the real world, information is imperfect, and perceptions are shaped by signals, even imperfect ones. The other weapon in the arsenal is maintaining excess capacity. Envision a factory operating far below its potential, capable of significantly increasing production at a moment's notice. This is excess capacity. Its mere existence acts as a credible threat. If a new firm dares to enter the market, the incumbent can quickly and dramatically increase output, flooding the market and driving prices down. The message is clear: we have the ability to crush you. The strategic value of excess capacity isn't merely about the ability to produce more. It's about the signal it sends. A company with significant idle resources is implicitly declaring its willingness to engage in a price war. This threat, if perceived as credible, can be enough to deter entry altogether. Consider the implications for antitrust enforcement in the digital age. Digital markets are often characterized by network effects and economies of scale. A single dominant platform can achieve near monopoly status. In such environments, entry deterrence becomes even more critical. The policymaker must grapple with the challenges of identifying and addressing anti-competitive behavior, disguised as legitimate business strategy. For example, a large tech company might acquire promising startups, not necessarily to integrate their technologies, but simply to eliminate them as potential competitors. This is often termed killer acquisitions, and it represents a subtle but powerful form of entry deterrence. The incumbent firm isn't necessarily lowering prices or flooding the market. It's preventing competition from ever materializing. The effectiveness of antitrust intervention in these scenarios hinges on our ability to accurately assess the counterfactual. What would the market look like without the anti-competitive conduct? This is a complex question, requiring careful economic analysis and a deep understanding of market dynamics. It requires considering not only the existing players, but also the potential entrants, the innovations that might have flourished, and the prices that consumers might have paid. As we conclude this exploration of entry deterrence, we are left with a lingering question. The dynamics of competition continue to evolve. How will future technologies and business models challenge the established frameworks of antitrust enforcement? What new forms of strategic barriers will emerge? And how will we adapt our understanding to ensure fair and competitive markets in the next economic phase? The future of competition policy. Adapting to new market realities, we've explored the landscape of existing competition policy, its triumphs and its limitations. Now, let us turn our gaze towards the horizon, towards the new market realities that demand an evolution in our thinking. At the heart of this evolution lies a deeper understanding of how firms actively shape the competitive environment, specifically through strategies of entry deterrence. Entry deterrence, at its core, is the art of discouraging potential rivals from entering a market, thereby preserving the incumbent's market power and profitability. It's a subtle game, played not always in plain sight, but woven into the very fabric of market structures. Two primary instruments in this strategic arsenal are limit pricing and the creation of excess capacity. Let's begin with limit pricing. Imagine a tranquil lake. The incumbent, the dominant firm, sets its price not to maximize short-term profits, but rather to maintain a price low enough to make entry unattractive for potential competitors. This price, the limit price, is below the level that would prevail under unrestrained monopoly, yet still allows the incumbent to earn a comfortable profit. The classical economist might argue that such behavior is simply rational, a logical response to market dynamics. Yet, the policymaker must consider whether this seemingly benign strategy unduly restricts competition and ultimately harms consumer welfare. Consider the delicate balance. If the limit price is set too high, it invites entry. If it is set too low, the incumbent sacrifices potential profits. The calculation hinges on estimating the costs and expected revenues of potential entrants, a task fraught with uncertainty. The incumbent must accurately assess the entry cost threshold, the minimum scale of operation or technological advantage a new entrant would need to compete effectively. This assessment requires a nuanced understanding of the industry's cost structure, demand characteristics, and the potential entrant's capabilities. Now, let us turn to the strategic use of capacity. Picture a vast field, capable of producing far more than current market demand requires. An incumbent firm might deliberately invest in excess capacity as a credible threat. This excess capacity signals to potential entrants that the incumbent has the resources and the willingness to increase production and drive down prices, should a new firm attempt to enter the market. This is a powerful deterrent, essentially saying, if you enter, I will flood the market and make it unprofitable for both of us. This strategy, however, is not without its risks. Maintaining excess capacity incurs costs. The incumbent must weigh the benefits of deterring entry against the expense of keeping productive assets idle. The credibility of the threat is also paramount. The policymaker will want to see evidence that suggests the commitment to this strategy is strong and credible. Furthermore, the effectiveness of these strategies depends heavily on the characteristics of the industry. Industries with high sunk costs, investments that cannot be easily recovered, are particularly susceptible to entry deterrence. Potential entrants are wary of making irreversible investments if they believe the incumbent will react aggressively. Network effects, where the value of a product or service increases as more people use it, also create natural advantages for incumbents, making entry more difficult. The challenge for competition policy lies in distinguishing between legitimate competitive advantages and anti-competitive strategies designed to stifle innovation and limit consumer choice. A firm that has achieved dominance through superior efficiency or innovation should not be penalized simply for being successful. However, if a firm is using its market power to create artificial barriers to entry, intervention may be warranted. The policymaker must also contend with the dynamic nature of markets. Strategies that are effective today may become obsolete tomorrow as new technologies and business models emerge. The future of competition policy, therefore, requires a more sophisticated and nuanced understanding of entry deterrence strategies. We need to develop analytical tools that can better identify and assess the impact of these strategies on market competition and consumer welfare. This will involve considering not only the immediate effects of these strategies, but also their long-term implications for innovation and economic growth. The river of commerce continues to flow, and we, as stewards of the economic landscape, must adapt our tools and techniques to navigate its ever-changing currents. And so, as we look towards the next chapter, we are left with a question. How might the rise of digital platforms and the prevalence of data create entirely new forms of strategic barriers, ones that current policy struggles to address effectively? The impact of artificial intelligence on entry and innovation. Welcome, once again, to our tranquil corner of economic thought. If you recall, in our previous exploration, we touched upon the burgeoning landscape of AI-driven productivity and its potential ripples across various industries. Now, let's turn our attention to a rather intriguing intersection: how artificial intelligence is reshaping the age-old dance of entry deterrence and strategic barriers, specifically focusing on limit pricing and capacity expansion. For decades, economists have studied the strategies employed by established firms to ward off potential entrants. These strategies, often collectively termed entry deterrence, can range from subtle pricing tactics to overt investments designed to discourage competition. Two particularly prominent examples are limit pricing and strategic capacity expansion. Imagine them as carefully calibrated defensive measures designed to maintain a firm's dominion over its market. Limit pricing, in its essence, involves an incumbent firm setting its price below the short-run profit-maximizing level. The classical economist, with their focus on rational behavior, saw this as a calculated gamble. The incumbent sacrifices some immediate profit to signal to potential entrants that the market is already saturated, or that the incumbent is willing to engage in a price war should entry occur. The idea is to make the market appear less attractive, diminishing the expected returns for any would-be competitor. It's a subtle message, whispered in the language of price points, saying, "This space is occupied. Tread carefully." Strategic capacity expansion, on the other hand, is a more muscular approach. Here, the incumbent invests in significantly expanding its production capacity, perhaps building a new factory or upgrading existing infrastructure. The aim isn't necessarily to meet immediate demand, but rather to demonstrate to potential entrants that the incumbent has the resources and the willingness to flood the market with supply, driving prices down and making entry unprofitable. Think of it as a show of strength, a flexing of industrial muscle intended to intimidate challengers before they even step into the arena. Now, consider the role of artificial intelligence within this framework. AI introduces a layer of complexity, a new set of tools for both incumbents and potential entrants. For incumbents, AI-powered predictive analytics can significantly refine limit pricing strategies. No longer must they rely on gut feelings or crude market analyses. AI can sift through vast datasets, identifying price points that are both effective in deterring entry and minimally detrimental to short-term profits. It allows for a more precise and nuanced understanding of the competitive landscape, transforming limit pricing from a blunt instrument into a finely tuned scalpel. Furthermore, AI can optimize capacity utilization in ways previously unimaginable. An incumbent with an AI-driven supply chain and manufacturing process can respond to potential entry threats with unparalleled speed and efficiency. It can dynamically adjust production levels, optimize inventory management, and even reconfigure manufacturing lines to produce different products, all in response to shifting competitive pressure. This agility effectively amplifies the credibility of the incumbent's threat to flood the market, making strategic capacity expansion a far more potent deterrent. However, the story doesn't end there. AI also empowers potential entrants. AI-driven market research tools can provide them with a more accurate assessment of the true profitability of a market, cutting through the incumbent's carefully crafted facade. AI can also help them identify niche markets or underserved segments that the incumbent may have overlooked. Moreover, AI-powered automation can significantly reduce the capital expenditure required for entry, leveling the playing field and making it easier for smaller, more agile firms to challenge established giants. The policymaker, therefore, faces a delicate balancing act. The benefits of AI-driven efficiency and innovation are undeniable. But the potential for AI to exacerbate existing power imbalances is also real. Regulating the use of AI in ways that promote competition without stifling innovation will be a crucial challenge in the years to come. It's a question of ensuring that the transformative power of AI is harnessed for the benefit of society as a whole, rather than simply reinforcing the dominance of a few established players. In essence, AI is not simply a new technology. It's a catalyst, accelerating the existing dynamics of entry deterrence and strategic competition. It enhances the capabilities of both incumbents and entrants, creating a more complex and fluid competitive landscape. The flow of innovation, the balance of power, all are being reshaped by this powerful force. But where does this leave us? As AI continues to evolve, will it ultimately lead to a more concentrated or more competitive market structure? This remains an open question, a lingering thought to carry with you as you drift off to sleep. Chapter 39: Sustainability as a Competitive Advantage and a Barrier to Entry. We've traversed the landscape of sustainable practices, observing their impact on cost structures and consumer behavior. Now, let us consider a more strategic vantage point: sustainability, not merely as a responsibility, but as a lever of competitive advantage, a shield against new entrants in the marketplace. This brings us to the intricate dance of entry deterrence. Think of the market as a carefully balanced ecosystem. New species, in the form of new companies, inevitably seek to enter, disrupting the established order. Incumbent firms, those already flourishing within this ecosystem, possess a natural inclination to maintain their dominance, to preserve the equilibrium that favors them. One potent strategy for achieving this is through strategic barriers to entry. These are not necessarily overt acts of aggression, but rather subtle manipulations of the market landscape that make it exceedingly difficult, or even prohibitively expensive, for new competitors to gain a foothold. This is where the principles of limit pricing and capacity management come into play, now viewed through the lens of sustainability. Limit pricing, in its classical form, involves an incumbent firm setting its price below the level that would maximize short-term profits. The rationale? To signal to potential entrants that the market is already saturated, that profit margins are razor-thin, and that the cost of entry is simply too high relative to the potential reward. Consider, for instance, a company that has invested heavily in renewable energy sources, achieving significant cost reductions through economies of scale. They can then set their prices slightly above their marginal cost, deterring new entrants who would face higher production costs due to reliance on less efficient, and often more polluting, technologies. The existing company is not trying to maximize profit, but deterring entrants by signaling current operations run at thin margins. This is not some kind of deception, but market realities. Sustainability initiatives can amplify the effectiveness of limit pricing. A firm with a robust and widely recognized commitment to sustainable practices enjoys a reputational advantage. Consumers may be willing to pay a slight premium for their products, even if superficially similar alternatives are available at a lower price. This green premium allows the incumbent to maintain a price point that is unattractive to new entrants who lack the established brand equity and consumer trust. The new entrants cannot lower their prices enough to compete due to the premium, and cannot raise their prices to achieve profit because of brand recognition. Capacity management, another weapon in the arsenal of entry deterrence, involves strategically investing in production capacity to signal to potential entrants that the incumbent is prepared to aggressively defend its market share. The classical economist might argue that excess capacity is inefficient, a drag on profitability. However, a strategically deployed capacity buffer can be a powerful deterrent. Imagine a company that has built a sprawling solar farm, generating far more electricity than it currently needs. This investment signals to potential competitors that the firm has the resources and the intent to flood the market with competitively priced energy if challenged. Sustainability adds another layer to this strategy. A firm that has invested in a green supply chain, securing exclusive access to sustainably sourced raw materials, effectively controls a critical resource. This creates a capacity constraint for potential entrants, even if they possess the financial resources to build their own production facilities. They simply may not be able to secure the necessary inputs to compete effectively. However, this power is not without its checks and balances. The policymaker plays a vital role in ensuring that sustainability-driven entry barriers do not stifle innovation or lead to monopolistic practices. Antitrust regulations must be carefully calibrated to prevent incumbents from using their sustainability credentials to unfairly disadvantage smaller, more nimble competitors. It's a delicate act of balance, ensuring that environmental progress is not achieved at the expense of fair competition. Furthermore, the landscape of sustainability is constantly evolving. What constitutes a cutting-edge, sustainable practice today may become the industry standard tomorrow. Incumbent firms must continuously innovate and adapt to maintain their competitive advantage. Complacency is a dangerous path, as it leaves them vulnerable to disruption from companies that embrace newer, more impactful sustainable technologies. So, as the sun slowly sets on this consideration, we are left with an intriguing question. What happens when sustainable practices are no longer a competitive advantage, but a universal imperative? What then defines the new battlegrounds for economic supremacy in a world driven by environmental consciousness? Chapter 40. Corporate social responsibility and ethical considerations. Having navigated the complexities of market selection and mode of entry, our journey now gently steers us towards the ethical landscape and the strategic maneuvers employed to shape competitive dynamics. Tonight, we contemplate corporate social responsibility, ethical considerations within entry strategies, and how the specter of entry deterrence looms large through limit pricing and capacity investments. Think of it as balancing the scales, ensuring that the pursuit of profit aligns with broader societal well-being and sustainable market competition. Corporate social responsibility, in its essence, reflects a commitment beyond mere profitability. It's a recognition that businesses operate within a complex ecosystem, influencing and being influenced by society, the environment, and various stakeholder groups. When formulating entry strategies, an ethically grounded approach becomes paramount. A new entrant's actions, even seemingly minor ones, can have far-reaching consequences, shaping the market's ethical tone for years to come. Consider a firm entering a developing nation. Are labor practices fair? Are environmental safeguards in place? Are the benefits of the new business shared equitably with the local community? These questions form the bedrock of ethical entry. Ignoring these considerations creates risk. Reputational damage, consumer boycotts, and even legal repercussions can follow. Now, let us turn our attention to the more tactical side of market entry, the strategies employed to deter potential competitors. A primary weapon in this arsenal is limit pricing. Imagine a mature market, dominated by a few established players. These incumbents may choose to set prices lower than their short-run profit-maximizing level. Why? To signal to potential entrants that the market is not as lucrative as it might seem. The incumbents are essentially sacrificing some current profit to discourage competition, preserving their long-term market share. The potential entrant, observing these low prices, might conclude that the returns on investment are insufficient to justify the risks associated with entry. The classical economist would remind us that this strategy works best when incumbents have cost advantages over potential entrants. If the incumbent's cost structure is substantially lower, it can credibly sustain these low prices, effectively barring entry. Another potent tool is capacity expansion. An established firm can strategically increase its production capacity, signaling to potential entrants that it is prepared to meet any new demand, even if it means engaging in a price war. This strategy relies on the credible threat of oversupply. Picture a scenario where a market demand is growing steadily. An incumbent firm, anticipating new entry, invests in a significantly larger plant than required to meet current demand. This sends a clear message: we have the capacity to flood the market if you try to take our share. This creates a strategic barrier, raising the stakes for any potential entrant. They must not only overcome the initial investment costs, but also be prepared to compete in a market potentially characterized by lower prices and aggressive output. However, even within the realm of strategic maneuvers, ethical boundaries exist. While limit pricing, if genuine, can be considered a legitimate competitive tactic, predatory pricing, aimed at driving existing competitors out of the market, crosses into unethical and often illegal territory. Capacity expansion, too, can become ethically questionable if undertaken with the sole intention of creating artificial barriers to entry, leading to market inefficiencies and reduced consumer choice. The policymaker often wrestles with a thin line between legitimate competition and anti-competitive practices. Navigating these complexities requires a careful balancing act. A company must strive to be profitable, competitive, and innovative, but not at the expense of ethical considerations or societal well-being. Integrating key SER principles into entry strategies is no longer merely a matter of public relations. It is a fundamental aspect of sustainable business practice. It requires a holistic approach, considering the impact of decisions on all stakeholders, employees, customers, communities, and the environment. As we conclude this chapter, a question lingers. How does the rise of platform economies and digital technologies further reshape the landscape of entry strategies, and what new ethical challenges do they present? This forms the next phase of our inquiry, where innovation and ethics must dance in equilibrium. Chapter 41. The Role of Lobbying and Political Influence in Market Regulation. Good evening. We've previously examined the theoretical underpinnings of entry deterrence, the measures incumbent firms might take to discourage new competitors from entering their market. Tonight, we gently shift our focus to the messy, real-world arena, where these strategies collide with political power and regulatory frameworks. Think of it as the theoretical engine meeting the political machine, the hum of calculation interacting with the rumble of influence. The economic models we've explored often assume a relatively level playing field, governed by rational actors responding to price signals. But this is rarely the whole picture. Regulations, ostensibly designed to promote fair competition and consumer welfare, can be shaped, consciously or unconsciously, by the very firms they are intended to regulate. This is where lobbying and political influence enter the equation, acting as subtle currents shaping the flow of market forces. Consider, for instance, the concept of limit pricing. In theory, an incumbent firm sets its price below the short-run profit-maximizing level to signal to potential entrants that the market is not as lucrative as it might appear. This discourages entry, allowing the incumbent to maintain a larger market share and, in the long run, accrue greater profits than they would if they maximized in the short term and faced competition. However, this scenario becomes infinitely more complex when lobbying is introduced. Imagine the incumbent firm actively lobbying policymakers to impose regulations that, while seemingly beneficial to consumers, disproportionately burden potential entrants. Perhaps regulations concerning environmental standards, safety protocols, or even accounting practices. These regulations could require substantial upfront investments, making it difficult for smaller or newer firms to enter the market. The classical economist might argue this is simply a distortion of the market, an artificial barrier. But the practical reality is that these regulations, shaped by lobbying efforts, can serve as powerful tools for entry deterrence, far more effective than simply manipulating price alone. It's not just about lowering prices. It's about raising the barriers. Similarly, capacity expansion, another strategic barrier, can be interwoven with political influence. An incumbent firm might invest in excess capacity, building more factories, acquiring more resources, not necessarily to meet current demand, but to signal to potential entrants that it has the ability to aggressively respond to any new competition. This demonstrates a commitment to maintaining market share, discouraging entry by creating the perception of a costly, protracted battle. Now, suppose this firm also actively lobbies for government subsidies or tax breaks for infrastructure development related to its capacity expansion. This artificially reduces its costs, making the threat of aggressive capacity utilization even more credible. The playing field tilts further. What was initially a strategic economic decision becomes amplified by the leverage of political influence. Furthermore, the complexity deepens when we consider the revolving door phenomenon. Individuals moving between regulatory agencies and the industries they regulate. This creates potential conflicts of interest and can lead to regulations that are more favorable to incumbents than to new entrants. The policymaker, ideally, should act as an impartial referee, but the subtle biases introduced by past experience and future career prospects can significantly affect regulatory outcomes. It's a delicate balancing act, attempting to maintain objectivity while navigating the complex web of relationships and incentives. It's not necessarily a story of blatant corruption, although that can certainly exist. More often, it's a matter of subtle persuasion, framing the narrative in a way that aligns the interests of the incumbent firm with the perceived public good. The skilled lobbyist understands the language of policy, the levers of power, and the art of crafting a compelling argument. They can influence the regulatory environment in ways that are often invisible to the casual observer. The implications for market efficiency and consumer welfare are significant. When regulations are shaped by lobbying efforts, they can create artificial barriers to entry, reduce competition, and ultimately lead to higher prices and lower quality goods and services. This undermines the very purpose of market regulation, which is to promote a fair and competitive marketplace. As we settle here, let us consider, if the flow of influence is as pervasive as it seems, how might we design regulatory frameworks that are more resistant to manipulation and better serve the public interest? How do we create a system of checks and balances that prevents the distortion of market forces by political power? These questions lie ahead, inviting us to consider the next phase of this complex economic landscape. Chapter 42. Case Study. Entry Deterrence. In the airline industry, we've spent considerable time tracing the contours of market structures, observing their natural tendencies towards equilibrium, a kind of gravitational pull towards states of balance. Now, let's shift our perspective slightly. What happens when that balance is actively, strategically, disrupted? Tonight, we'll consider entry deterrence and how firms, particularly in the airline industry, build barriers to protect their territory. Imagine a vast, open sky. It seems a welcoming place for new airlines, doesn't it? Yet, the reality is far more complex, layered with strategic considerations that actively discourage newcomers. Entry deterrence is the art of making the sky less inviting, of creating conditions that convince potential competitors that the journey isn't worth the cost. The two primary tools we'll consider are limit pricing and excess capacity. Limit pricing, in its simplest form, involves an incumbent firm setting its price below the level that would maximize its short-term profits. Why would a firm willingly sacrifice potential earnings? The answer lies in the long game. By setting a low price, the incumbent signals to potential entrants that the market is already highly competitive, that profit margins are thin, and that entry would be unprofitable. The classical economist, observing this, would murmur something about rational expectations and informed decision-making. He'd argue that the potential entrant, seeing the low prices, correctly anticipates the lack of future profit and chooses to stay out. Think of it like this: a seasoned chess player, seeing a promising opening for their opponent, proactively sacrifices a pawn to close off the critical pathways, preventing a more substantial attack later. The initial sacrifice seems disadvantageous, but it secures a more stable overall position. Limit pricing operates on a similar principle. It's a deliberate reduction in current profit to secure future market share. Excess capacity is the second strategic tool. It involves an incumbent firm maintaining a production capacity significantly larger than its current output. In the airline industry, this might manifest as owning more aircraft than are currently needed for scheduled flights, or securing more landing slots at airports than are routinely used. The purpose is to create a credible threat of a rapid and substantial increase in output should a new firm attempt to enter the market. Imagine a dam holding back a vast reservoir of water. The dam represents the incumbent's unused capacity. The reservoir represents the potential increase in supply. If a small stream, representing a new entrant, begins to trickle into the market, the incumbent can, theoretically, open the floodgates, unleashing a torrent of supply that would quickly overwhelm the new arrival, driving prices down and making the entry unsustainable. This is a powerful deterrent, but it is also costly. Maintaining excess capacity requires significant investment, and those resources could be used elsewhere. The effectiveness of this strategy depends on its credibility. The potential entrant must believe that the incumbent is truly willing to deploy its excess capacity, even if it means incurring short-term loss. The policymaker, ever watchful, worries about the efficiency of all this. Are resources being wasted on building deterrents rather than serving customers? The airline industry, with its high fixed costs and often intense competition, provides fertile ground for the application of these strategies. Legacy carriers, in particular, often possess significant advantages in terms of brand recognition, established routes, and access to key infrastructure. They can leverage these advantages to deter entry, protecting their market share and maintaining higher profit margins. We see this, for example, in the aggressive pricing strategies often employed on routes where low-cost carriers attempt to establish a foothold. The incumbent carrier may temporarily lower fares, even to loss-making levels, to demonstrate its commitment to defending its territory. Consider this also: the strategic allocation of airport slots. Airports, especially those in major metropolitan areas, are often capacity constrained. The limited availability of landing slots creates a significant barrier to entry for new airlines. Incumbent carriers, having secured these slots over years of operation, can effectively control access to the market. Securing new slots or even purchasing existing ones can be prohibitively expensive for new entrants, effectively locking them out of certain routes. Of course, these strategies are not without their limitations. Limit pricing can be difficult to implement effectively, particularly in markets with differentiated products or where consumers are not perfectly price sensitive. Excess capacity can be expensive to maintain, and its credibility as a deterrent depends on the incumbent's reputation and its willingness to engage in price wars. Further, regulatory scrutiny can limit the extent to which firms can engage in overtly anti-competitive practices. The policymaker must be constantly vigilant, ensuring a level playing field. So, as the night deepens, consider the complex dance between established players and aspiring entrants in the economic ecosystem. We've explored two prominent strategies: limit pricing and excess capacity. But are these the only tools available? And what unforeseen strategies might be lurking, waiting to disrupt the established order? These are questions for another evening. For now, let's rest. Chapter 43. Case Study: Limit Pricing and Capacity in the Telecommunications Sector. Welcome back. Last time, we explored the theoretical underpinnings of entry deterrence. Now, let's ground these concepts in a real-world scenario: the telecommunications sector. Specifically, we'll examine how limit pricing and capacity investments have been strategically employed to create barriers to entry. Think of this as a detailed observation, a focused lens upon a single ecosystem. The telecommunications industry, historically, has been fertile ground for observing entry deterrence strategies. Its inherent characteristics, high fixed costs, significant economies of scale, and often regulatory oversight, create an environment where incumbents have considerable power to shape the competitive landscape. We are, after all, looking at systems, and those with early purchase within those systems have a distinct advantage. Limit pricing, as a strategy, involves an incumbent firm setting a price lower than the short-run profit-maximizing level. The aim is to dissuade potential entrants who, observing the existing price, may conclude that entering the market would not be sufficiently profitable. The classical economist might argue that this is a distortion of the natural market forces. However, the incumbent is acting rationally, albeit strategically, within the parameters of the existing market. It's a delicate balancing act. The incumbent forgoes some immediate profit to secure long-term market dominance. This is especially true in markets with significant network effects, where the value of the service increases as more users join the network. Consider a hypothetical national telecommunications provider, let's call them Telco Prime, facing the prospect of new entrants in the broadband internet market. Telco Prime could choose to set its broadband prices at a level that barely covers its average total costs, signaling to potential competitors that there is little room for profit. If potential entrants have higher costs or lack the brand recognition of Telco Prime, this limit pricing strategy can be quite effective. They perceive a hostile environment and reconsider their entry plans. It's the economic equivalent of a shepherd carefully pruning the grass to ensure his flock has ample grazing, while discouraging others from encroaching. Beyond pricing, capacity investments represent another potent tool for entry deterrence. By investing heavily in network infrastructure and building excess capacity, an incumbent firm can send a credible signal that it is prepared to meet any surge in demand that might arise from new competitors. This war chest of capacity can deter entry in two ways. First, it demonstrates that the incumbent can aggressively respond to any attempt to capture market share. Second, it raises the capital requirements for potential entrants, who must now invest even more to compete with the incumbent's superior infrastructure. The policymaker may be concerned with underutilization of existing resources and the potential misallocation of capital. However, the incumbent's perspective is shaped by the need for long-term security. For instance, Telco Prime might invest heavily in fiber optic cables and high-speed internet infrastructure, even in areas where current demand is relatively low. This overinvestment in capacity signals to potential entrants that Telco Prime is prepared to aggressively defend its market share. A new entrant, contemplating the costs of building a comparable network, may be discouraged from entering the market altogether. The flow of investment shapes the landscape of competition. Furthermore, the effectiveness of limit pricing and capacity investments can be amplified by regulatory factors. If, for example, Telco Prime has preferential access to government subsidies or benefits from favorable regulatory treatment, it can further lower its costs and strengthen its position in the market. Regulations, in their complexity, can thus become unintended accomplices in the creation of barriers to entry. Think of it as the wind guiding the flow of a river. Some currents are helped and others are diverted. However, these strategies are not without their risks. Maintaining a lower than profit maximizing price can reduce the incumbent's short-term profitability. Excess capacity investments can be costly, and the returns may not materialize if demand does not grow as anticipated. The market is a dynamic system. Strategies must be adjusted as conditions change. The classical economist would question the sustainability of a system that sacrifices short-term gain for long-term gain that has not been realized. Ultimately, the success of entry deterrent strategies depends on a complex interplay of factors, including the specific characteristics of the industry, the regulatory environment, and the capabilities and resources of both the incumbent firm and potential entrants. The telecommunications sector, with its unique blend of technological innovation, regulatory oversight, and strategic maneuvering, provides a rich case study for understanding the practical implications of these economic principles. Each market must have its own form of self-regulation, a delicate balance that is always attempting to be achieved. As we conclude, consider this. In a world of rapidly evolving technology and shifting consumer preferences, how can policymakers balance the need to promote competition with the desire to foster innovation and investment in the telecommunications sector? What lasting barriers might be built on temporary advantage? Chapter 44. The Future of Entry Deterrence. New Strategies and Emerging Challenges. As we've explored the historical ebb and flow of market power and competitive pressures, we arrive at a crucial juncture. We've seen how established firms, like silent sentinels, have erected barriers to protect their domains. Now, let's gently shift our focus. Tonight, we'll consider the evolving landscape of entry deterrence, the new strategic tools employed, and the novel challenges they present in our interconnected world. Traditional entry deterrence, as we know, often revolved around limit pricing and capacity expansion. The incumbent, in effect, said, "Look, the price is this low, and my capacity is this large. Entering this market will only lead to losses for you." It was a clear signal, a deterrent painted boldly across the competitive horizon. However, this paradigm is slowly giving way to more nuanced and sophisticated approaches. The winds of technological change and globalization are reshaping the battlefield. One significant development is the rise of dynamic capabilities. Instead of merely focusing on static advantages like low costs or high capacity, firms are now investing in the ability to adapt and innovate rapidly. Think of it as a stream, constantly reshaping its course to navigate around obstacles. An incumbent with strong dynamic capabilities can credibly signal that it will quickly respond to any new entrant, rendering their advantages obsolete almost as soon as they materialize. This isn't just about lowering prices or building more factories. It's about the threat of innovation, the potential to disrupt the market in unforeseen ways. This raises an interesting point. The effectiveness of entry deterrence strategies is intrinsically linked to the credibility of the incumbent's commitment. The classical economist might argue that actions speak louder than words. Simply saying you will lower prices isn't enough. You have to actually lower them, incurring a cost up front to deter future entry. This commitment problem has always been a central challenge, but it becomes even more acute in the age of dynamic capabilities. How can a firm credibly commit to innovating in ways that are, by definition, uncertain? The answer, perhaps, lies in reputation. Building a track record of innovation and responsiveness can be a powerful signal. The policymaker, watching from afar, sees a firm that has consistently adapted to changing market conditions and responded aggressively to previous entrants. This history creates a perception of invincibility, a belief that any new challenger will face a formidable opponent. This, in turn, can deter potential entrants without the incumbent having to incur significant costs up front. Another emerging challenge stems from the increasing complexity of global value chains. In the past, a firm might have controlled all the critical inputs necessary to compete in a market. This control provided a natural barrier to entry. But today, many industries are characterized by intricate networks of suppliers and distributors, often spanning multiple countries. This makes it more difficult for incumbents to control all the relevant resources and prevent new entrants from gaining access to them. Furthermore, the digital economy has introduced entirely new dimensions to entry deterrence. Network effects, for example, can create powerful advantages for incumbents. The larger a firm's user base, the more valuable its product or service becomes, making it difficult for new entrants to gain traction. Think of social media platforms or ride-sharing apps. The established player often enjoys a significant advantage simply by virtue of its size. Data, too, has become a crucial strategic asset. Firms that can collect and analyze vast amounts of data about their customers can gain a deeper understanding of their needs and preferences, allowing them to tailor their products and services more effectively. This data advantage can be a significant barrier to entry, as new entrants struggle to compete without access to the same level of insight. However, these new strategies and emerging challenges also present opportunities. Antitrust authorities, ever vigilant, are increasingly scrutinizing the behavior of dominant firms in the digital economy, seeking to prevent them from abusing their market power. The policymaker is keenly aware of the need to balance the benefits of innovation with the potential for anti-competitive behavior. As we drift toward the dawn, consider this. How will future regulation address the subtle dance between legitimate entry deterrence and unlawful monopolization in markets defined by information and innovation? This question, like the soft glow of the rising sun, illuminates our path to the next chapter. What new form will market power take as we move into an era defined by artificial intelligence and decentralized technologies? Chapter 45, Conclusion. The enduring importance of entry in competitive markets. And so, after our journey through the intricate dance of market dynamics, we arrive at a point of reflection. We have explored the landscape of competition, observing the strategies employed by incumbents to safeguard their position, and the hurdles faced by newcomers seeking to carve out their own space. We now turn to consider the enduring significance of entry and the barriers that hinder it in shaping the very nature of competitive markets. Consider, if you will, the image of a garden. A vibrant ecosystem flourishes when new seedlings can take root, contributing to the overall diversity and resilience of the garden. Conversely, if a few established trees block out all the sunlight, preventing anything else from growing, the garden stagnates. The market, too, is such a garden. Entry, like sunshine and water, is essential for its healthy growth. It fuels innovation, compels incumbents to improve efficiency, and ultimately benefits the consumer through lower prices and greater choice. Entry deterrence, in its many forms, is akin to those overshadowing trees. We have seen how limit pricing, a seemingly benevolent act of keeping prices low, can actually function as a barrier to entry. The incumbent, by sacrificing short-term profits, sends a signal. This market is not lucrative enough for you to join. Potential entrants, observing the already low prices, may be dissuaded from investing the resources necessary to compete. It is a subtle, yet powerful, form of protectionism. Similarly, the establishment of excess capacity, the ability to produce far more than current demand requires, can serve as a credible threat. The incumbent signals its willingness to flood the market with goods should a new competitor dare to enter. This potential for retaliatory action creates a chilling effect, discouraging entry even by firms with innovative ideas or superior products. It is a game of brinkmanship, where the mere possibility of a price war can be enough to maintain dominance. Now, let us consider the role of the policymaker in this delicate ecosystem. Their responsibility is to ensure that the garden remains fertile, that new entrants have a fair chance to flourish. This requires careful scrutiny of incumbent behavior. Are prices being kept artificially low with the express purpose of deterring competition? Is excess capacity being maintained solely as a weapon against potential entrants, or does it serve a legitimate business purpose? Answering these questions requires a nuanced understanding of the market dynamics at play. The policymaker must weigh the benefits of protecting established firms against the potential harm to innovation and consumer welfare. It is a balancing act, a continuous process of adjusting the regulatory framework to ensure that the forces of competition are allowed to operate freely, yet fairly. The classical economist, observing this landscape, might point to the inherent tension between static and dynamic efficiency. Limit pricing, for instance, may lead to lower prices in the short run, but it could stifle innovation and reduce consumer choice in the long run. The challenge lies in finding the optimal balance, in creating a market structure that fosters both present-day well-being and future progress. Consider also the impact of strategic barriers on the overall resilience of the economic system. Markets dominated by a few powerful incumbents are often less adaptable to external shocks. Innovation tends to be incremental, focused on protecting existing market share rather than exploring new frontiers. Entry, by injecting fresh ideas and challenging established norms, can disrupt this inertia and drive transformative change. A market open to entry is a market that is better equipped to navigate the uncertainties of the future. Therefore, the enduring importance of entry in competitive markets cannot be overstated. It is the lifeblood of innovation, the engine of efficiency, and the guarantor of consumer welfare. The strategic barriers erected by incumbents, while perhaps rational from their individual perspective, can have detrimental consequences for the overall health of the economy. Maintaining a level playing field, where new entrants have a fair opportunity to compete, is crucial for sustained economic growth and prosperity. But as we close this chapter, one question lingers in the air, a seed of thought for our next exploration. What happens when the very definition of entry itself is transformed? What are the implications when new technologies and business models allow firms to circumvent traditional barriers to entry altogether, disrupting entire industries in the process? The answer, as always, lies in understanding the ever-evolving dance of competition.